My Lords, I'm not aware of any timetable, and I'm not certain there is one. For Ukraine to become a member of NATO, the prerequisite is that there are no foreign troops on its soil. There certainly are foreign troops on its soil in vast quantities. Until that is resolved, I cannot believe that the NATO alliance can do anything other than continue in its resilient resistance.
Yeah.
My Lords, the time allotted for that question has now elapsed. Shall we take a moment just to shuffle the benches a little bit? My Lords, I think we are ready to get going, having reduced the numbers to the hardcore. Shall we begin? Second reading of the Automated Vehicles Bill. Oh, you do have to. Sorry. I have a loud voice, but perhaps not loud enough. Second reading of the Automated Vehicles Bill. Lord Davis of Gower on behalf of Baroness Vere of Norbiton.
My Lords, on behalf of my noble friend Baroness Vere of Norbiton, I beg to move that this bill be now read a second time. Self-driving vehicles offer an unprecedented opportunity to improve the safety and connectivity of our road network. Unencumbered by fatigue, distraction, frustration or intoxication, and built from the ground up to obey the rules of the road, self-driving vehicles could one day far exceed the standards of even the safest human drivers. With 88% of road incidents currently involving human error, the potential for these technologies to reduce injury and save lives is plain to see. Self-driving vehicles could also improve connectivity across the country, opening up new options for travel and connecting people to amenities, jobs and education. Indeed, it is those currently at greatest risk of isolation, the elderly, those with disabilities and our rural communities, who could see the greatest benefit from some of these new technologies. My Lords, the international self-driving market has vast growth potential. Playing to our strengths in research and innovation, and with a robust regulatory scheme in place, or system in place, the UK could capture as much as 42 billion of that market by 2035. And thanks to close collaboration between government, industry and academia over the last decade, we are already well on our way. We have worked with developers to launch trials across the UK, including self-driving bus services in Edinburgh and self-driving heavy goods vehicles in Sunderland. These trials are taking place with safety drivers on board and provide proof of concept for a technology that is coming into maturity. We have also worked to set a clear direction of travel for the sector. We were an early mover in 2015, launching a code of practice for trialling self-driving vehicles on public roads. In 2018, Parliament passed the Automated and Electric Vehicles Act, ensuring there is a clear and direct route to compensation for any harm caused by a vehicle when driving itself. And in August last year, we published the Connected and Automated Mobility 2025 paper, setting out the government's vision for bringing the benefits of self-driving vehicles to the UK. But as the technology continues to mature and trials look to advance beyond the need for safety drivers, we need to ensure that the UK stays ahead of the curve. We must support the deployment of self-driving vehicles with a comprehensive legal framework, one that can deliver high standards of safety, ensure clear accountability and win the confidence of both the public and the sector. My Lords, this bill, the Automated Vehicles Bill, provides that comprehensive legal framework. At present, responsibility for safe and legal driving rests solely with the human driver. This is the case even when they employ one of the many advanced driver assistance features currently available on the market, such as adaptive cruise control, automatic parking, or automatic emergency braking. When these features advance beyond mere assistance and truly self-driving technology becomes a reality, it will no longer be reasonable to hold the human driver responsible for the vehicle's behaviour. To address this fundamental change, the Automated Vehicles Bill will, for the first time, provide for corporate entities to assume responsibility for how self-driving vehicles behave, underpinned by a robust framework of safety standards, monitoring and enforcement. This legislation implements the recommendations of a 4-year review by the Law Commission of England and Wales and the Scottish Law Commission. Their joint report draws on countless hours of expert legal analysis and 3 rounds of public consultation, yielding hundreds of responses. I am grateful to the Commissioners for their work and for providing such a robust set of foundations for this bill. The aims of the bill, my Lords, moving now to the main measures of the bill and beginning with the issue I know rightly will be at the forefront of noble Lords' minds. Safety will be baked into every facet of this new regime from the very beginning. Only vehicles that meet the self-driving test will be authorised as self-driving. To satisfy this test, they will need to meet rigorous standards and be capable of driving safely and legally without human intervention. The test will be informed by a statement of safety principles, published by government following consultation, and setting out the behaviours that self-driving vehicles should be expected to achieve. We intend that these safety principles will be drafted in line with government's safety ambition, that self-driving vehicles should meet an equivalent level of safety to that of a careful and competent human driver. Perhaps regrettably, I should stress that this is in fact a much higher standard than that of the average driver on UK roads. A new authorisation scheme will supplement the existing vehicle approval process and apply the self-driving test. The scheme will guarantee that there is an authorised self-driving entity, or ASDE, associated with every self-driving feature deployed in vehicles on our roads. The ASDE, like a corporate entity such as the manufacturer or software developer, will assume responsibility for how the vehicle drives when the self-driving feature is activated. Once authorised, the vehicle and the ASDE will be subject to ongoing safety monitoring under the in-use regulatory scheme. Any safety-critical changes to the self-driving feature will require reauthorisation. My Lords, the bill distinguishes between 2 types of self-driving features: those that can complete an entire journey in self-driving mode, and those that can only complete part of a journey, thus requiring the option of handing back control to a human driver in certain contexts. In the latter case, while the vehicle is driving itself, the driver assumes a new role, which we call the user in charge. The bill shields the user in charge from prosecution for offences relating to the driving task. The user in charge remains responsible for other elements not relating to the driving task, such as roadworthiness and insurance. Naturally, they are required to resume control if directed to by the vehicle, subject to being given sufficient time to regain awareness. The no user in charge, NUIC. Some features will follow the vehicle to complete an entire journey without needing the option of handing back to a human. These features will not require a user in charge, people in the vehicle, if indeed there are any at all. It would simply be considered passengers, would all simply be considered passengers while the self-driving vehicle is activated. We refer to these as no user in charge features. The bill creates a new legal entity for these circumstances, a licensed no user in charge operator, also known as a NUIC operator. The NUIC operator will be comparable to a fleet operator, responsible for overseeing the vehicle and responding to incidents such as breakdowns. As always, the ASDE retains responsibility for how the vehicle drives. The bill includes a strict obligation on both these new entities, and NUIC operators, to disclose safety data as part of in-use regulation, with criminal penalties for managers if they fail to comply. The bill also grants powers to investigate incidents and issue regulatory sanctions. We will be able to direct entities to take certain actions to prevent future incidents, to issue compensation to those impacted, or to pay fines. The Secretary of State will have unilateral power to suspend or alter any self-driving authorisation rapidly, if necessary to protect public safety. The bill also contains measures to allow for safety investigations to be undertaken by independent statutory inspectors. These inspectors' reports will not apportion blame or liability, but instead will make recommendations to improve safety in the sector as a whole. Together, the individual elements of the safety framework, approval, authorisation, in-use regulation, operator licensing and incident investigation will form a safety feedback loop so that learning and improvement is baked in. My Lords, this bill represents a major step in creating a full legal framework for self-driving vehicles. But it is not the only step. As with any new technology, we must regulate alongside its growth, building in the right checks and balances and the flexibility to respond to new developments and new use cases. This bill will be followed by consultations and secondary legislation on the core elements that I have outlined. The Statement of Safety Principles will be subject to parliamentary scrutiny, as will the authorisation and approval requirements and the in-use regulation scheme. All of the secondary legislative elements that make up the cohesive whole will be consulted on following royal assent, bringing in the views of the public, industry and academia. They will be delivered through secondary legislation or statutory guidance, which can be developed over time and subsequently amended as the technology evolves. Policy scoping notes relating to elements of the secondary legislation programme have been published, and I would encourage noble lords to review them ahead of committee stage. I'm also happy to be able to arrange in-depth briefings as required. My Lords, before I conclude, I would like to clarify the extent of the bill. The scope of the Law Commission's review was self-driving regulation in relation to road vehicles. Therefore, this bill does not deal with other forms of self-driving technology, such as drones, aircraft or seacraft. The bill will extend to Great Britain self-driving vehicles which are authorised under the new regime can only be authorised to use their self-driving features in England, Wales and Scotland. Whilst there is no explicit legal prohibition on their use if they cross the border into Northern Ireland, they would be operating without the clarity of legal responsibility that the bill will provide. Operation with a safety driver or in conventional human-driven mode will still be possible. My Lords, let me conclude by highlighting again the opportunities here, for they are threefold. The first is road safety. Over 1,500 people are killed on our roads each year, each one a tragic loss felt so keenly by friends and family. There is now an opportunity to start to reduce that loss. The bill is explicit that our safety principles must be framed with a view to improving road safety, and our safety ambition goes beyond this, setting a standard well above that of the average human driver. The second opportunity is connectivity. Self-driving vehicles could significantly improve the efficiency of passenger and freight traffic on our roads, while offering new travel options to those most at risk of isolation. And finally, the economic opportunity. Recent years have seen astonishing leaps forward in the UK's homegrown self-driving vehicle sector. The Law Commission's thorough and detailed review on this subject lasted 4 years. In that same period, the UK self-driving sector generated £475 million of direct investment and created 1,500 new jobs. With the Law Commission's work as its foundation, this legislation will deliver the vital legal clarity that the UK needs to retain its position at the global vanguard of this new technology. My Lords, I beg to move.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time.
My Lords, can I begin by welcoming the introduction of this long-awaited bill to regulate self-driving vehicles. The bill before us introduces a legal framework to enable this developing technology in the UK, building on the insurance measures for automated cars in the Automated and Electric Vehicle Act 2018, as well as policies set out in the August 2022 paper. Unfortunately, I feel that this bill is not enough to give the public or industry confidence in the emerging technology. This bare bones regulations allows driverless cars on our roads, sets minimum standards and makes manufacturers responsible, but it fails to properly prepare for the transition period where some vehicles are automated and others not. The government need to prepare for the transition with a plan to monitor and prepare for the rollout, to give industry the certainty that they need to invest and give the public the confidence that they will be safe on our roads. I am also concerned that the bill also offers no protection for the jobs which could be lost during the transition, which is why these benches will be calling on the government to engage with trade unions and workers to make sure that automation creates jobs rather than loses them. Can I therefore ask the Minister what assessment they have made of how many new jobs could be created in the self-driving vehicle industry? And can I also ask what preliminary discussions the Minister has had with trade unions regarding the rollout? There are also missed opportunities in this bill, and throughout its passage, I hope the House will consider potential loopholes in the legislation. Could I ask, for example, why the bill does not cover autonomous robots, such as personal delivery devices? And turning briefly to the marketing restrictions, will the Minister explain what instances have led to these clauses? Are misleading marketing practices for self-driving vehicles commonplace either here in the UK or elsewhere in the world? Moving on to the liability sections, the bill outlines a provision for an independent inspector who is able to investigate collisions and incidents involving automated vehicles to assess what technology may need to be improved, but not to indicate blame or cause. However, given the bill outlines specific legal accountability, depending on whether the driver or automated vehicle is in control in order to assign cause, does the Minister believe that the inspector should have similar, though non-legally binding, power in order to allow them to independently report to Parliament concerning the effect and safety of automated vehicles on Britain's roads? And turning to the clauses which highlights the differences between user-in-charge vehicles, which requires a legal and fit driver to assume vehicle control for parts of a journey, and a non-user-in-charge vehicle, which can operate entirely autonomously for an entire journey. The Minister will know that non-user-in-charge vehicles do not require a legal and fit driver to be in the vehicle at any point during the journey. Will the Minister therefore outline the safety regulations should a non-user-in-charge vehicle suffer a fault during a journey, given that there may be no legal and fit driver present to assume control of the vehicle? My Lords, to conclude, the passage of this bill will have the support of these benches, but I hope the Minister will work constructively with members from across the House to address any deficiencies or shortcomings. Autonomous vehicles present an exciting opportunity which, is properly utilised and regulated by this government, could create a safer and more prosperous way of living. Unfortunately, the transition and rollout of this technology could also pose serious challenges to public safety and to jobs. Only vehicles which are safe for drivers, passengers and pedestrians should be allowed on our roads, and ministers must review all available evidence to ensure this remains the case. and I will finish by urging the Minister again to take steps to guarantee that the introduction of autonomous vehicles brings decent new jobs here in the UK. Automation has an incredible potential to make our lives simpler and more prosperous, but if not properly managed and regulated, it could create greater risks than opportunities.
My Lords, I declare my interest that a member of my family works in the vehicle connectivity sector, but I have no financial interests. I've migrated to this bill from my usual territory of financial services, business and intellectual property, and it's those aspects which I will mainly cover. At present, there's a thriving ecosystem, including small and innovative businesses in the automated and connected vehicle sectors, especially on the software side, and whose protection and income streams are based on intellectual property and data. And while I understand and appreciate the work that has been done by the law commissions and the legal framework in the bill, I do have questions about its impact on that ecosystem, for small businesses in particular, and for the preservation of intellectual property rights and rights to monetize data. My concern is heightened by the already prevalent tendency to default to big-name providers, including large overseas technology companies winning government contracts. There is already an unlevel playing field caused by place-safe selection of dominant companies, and that dominance is further reinforced by the acquisition of data for themselves when they are selected for important UK projects. Government has a role to play here if it wants to emerge with UK champions, and that includes government having expertise to analyse bids from less obvious sources and without forcing commercial disclosures of a type not normally sought from large entities. I have also noted the announcement that the government may be announcing the National Security and Investment Act as regards mergers and acquisitions, and that may also further benefit big-name companies from abroad. Turning to the bill, I wonder how the present ecosystem will be affected by the conditions surrounding the new regulated entities. This is a point where information requirements could force disclosures or distort contracts, essentially stripping supply chain companies of their commercial IP and data exploitation opportunities. It would be unfortunate for smaller companies to be forced into a choice between ultimate liability and massive insurance costs, or contract and licensing provisions that leverage away their own data exploitation possibilities. I'll now turn more specifically to insurance. At the commercial level, the London market is well placed to develop cover for the UK and elsewhere. So I noted with interest that the government announced a consultation on captives, that is, an insurance company which is a wholly owned subsidiary providing insurance to its non-insurance parent company or companies. Somewhat ironically, London has the best experts for this underwriting, but we don't have any captives within the UK. Captives might be attractive for the automated vehicles sector with their associated commercial considerations, including as a part of providing good financial standing. But will the UK regulator, the Prudential Regulation Authority, take exception to the monoline nature of captives and make life difficult? Has the Minister any information in that regard, and have there been cross-departmental discussions? The other insurance aspect is for the consumer, with a particular point of interest about when does a driver become liable after transition from automated driving. Naturally, insurance companies are interested in data around those transitions. How many times do those instances happen, in what circumstances and where, driving patterns and so on. that is commercially useful to insurance companies for the purposes of assessing risk, getting the prices right, and ascertaining whether and who is liable. My question is, should they get it all for free? Some insurance companies are already involved in funding developments. Others are not. Should their positions be the same? Over time, information will derive naturally from actual claims, but more generally, this is an area where the entitled to benefit from or monetize data resides elsewhere. Some of this kind of information may also be delved into for other investigatory purposes, including and around authorization and licensing. And for the consumer, there is the dangling threat of insurance companies having to analyse whether the response at handover was what a competent driver would do. Putting a simple time limit for liability on the switch is making light of a difficult situation. Fighter pilots are trained in handovers, and I doubt that they're doing crosswords in the meanwhile, but that is a position that is envisaged in the documents that I've read. I've spent a lot of time myself being driven around rather than driving, exactly as a safety precaution, and many times have looked up from reading a brief to wonder where on earth I am and feeling quite disoriented. And that's in a constituency that I'm supposed to know and was representing. Regrettably, we will need statistics before we know the interval after handover that is fair to compare with a competent driver in ordinary circumstances. Even if we can define that, because it will be different on a straight road with no manoeuvres expected to when it's a much more complex layout or circumstances when the AV can't cope anymore. Potentially this puts a lot of uncertainty onto the consumer as well as insurance companies, and I think there may be a role for a levy and compensation model around the transitions, at least initially. Clause 14 of the bill allows access to data for insurance purposes, but it's not clear to me whether this is intended to be free, and perhaps the Minister could shed some light on that. Already there is lobbying to make the wording mandatory. Now this is relevant because provisions in the bill do acknowledge commercial rights, in this context clause 42 section 7, which applies to the whole Part 1, but that does not protect commercial rights where the disclosure and use by third parties is considered necessary. Clause 14 already seems to imply information disclosures to insurers and others may be necessary. Regulations themselves might make it so, and the industry lobby wants to make it so on the face of the bill. Either route to mandating puts it outside the commercial harm provision in subsection 7. So I think that needs more examination, and I would suggest along the lines of fair and reasonable compensation for commercial use of information. Finally, I have some interests in and around the proof of safety and proof of concept, in that it takes a vast amount of data to be able statistically to prove that something is safer than exists already. I mean, road fatality in the UK is 5 per billion miles driven. And if you're to compare it with, say, a statistically significant number, you might have to look at, well, the number of driven miles for 50 deaths. But that's 10 billion miles driven. And that could be 100,000 AVs driving 10,000 miles, or 10,000 AVs driving 100,000 miles. That's an awful lot of miles, and we only have, 100 to 500 cars that could vehicles that could potentially be doing it. So that converts to 20 to 100 years, dependent upon which end of that we're at. So I'm interested to know, how are we going to get this kind of mileage done? Will it be all in the UK? will we accept evidence from other countries? Will it be for each AV? Because why should you have your statistics marred by a bad apple? And if it is that we're going to accept evidence from other countries, can we be sure that it's going to be in similar kinds of driving conditions? I think there's a lot more that could be discussed around that, but it's a very big statistical job to prove that something is safer than something else. My Lords, I do recognise that the bill is the start of constructing a framework and not the end, and so I look forward to exploring its effects and some of the things that I have raised further at committee stage.
My Lords, it's a great pleasure to follow the noble lady and particularly hear some of her insights on the insurance industry. My Lords, could I congratulate my noble friend on his appointment to the front bench in the transport portfolio. We go back a long way and I'm delighted that he's in this role. My Lords, I declare my interests as set out in the register. I am, my Lords, very, very supportive of this legislation. I think it's excellent legislation and it's very, very necessary. AI and automated vehicles present great positive opportunities for our country and for the people who live here, including workers, properly grabbed. This should be an increase of jobs in the United Kingdom, and this is what this legislation is all about. For the individual, this is the opportunity for people being transported to be able to enhance relaxation in a vehicle or to work in a vehicle while the vehicle is being driven. It will improve road safety with fewer accidents properly handled, and I know that's something we will want to look at as the legislation passes through your Lordship's House. I didn't want to go into any detail on particular provisions at second reading, my Lords, just to talk about the general principles of the legislation. It will allow this legislation will allow non-drivers, older drivers, partially sighted drivers and blind the freedom to be driven. It will allow freight to be transported at non-peak hours more easily. It will, properly handled, reduce carbon emissions. It will reduce the need for roadside assistance for accidents. It will lead to lower insurance premiums for vehicle owners who are being driven. This is the golden inheritance that we will have if we tackle this legislation in the right way. And of course, the devil will be in the detail. I appreciate that. But this legislation is important. Moving away from the individual, the impact on the UK economy will be massive, with possibilities, along with other countries who will necessarily be our competitors, the US, Israel, China, and other countries in Europe. But no doubt there will be also the facility for cooperation, and I wonder if my noble friend will perhaps be able to indicate if there have been discussions with other countries. I had the opportunity of corresponding with John Aquino of Cruise in Silicon Valley, and I think it's Silicon Valley where they have had the most progress, to hear about some of the insights there and some of the possibilities. And he's told me of work happening in our own country, Wave AI in Cambridge and London in particular. The government has since 2015 funded the new Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles, and I'd be keen to hear from my noble friend what the budget is and what work has been done, because work is being done as we speak on ensuring that we grapple with these opportunities. It's a government body with scientific and technological and expertise, and it would be good to hear what precisely it's doing from my noble friend, and as I say, the budget as well, and what liaison there is with other countries. The government, I think, deserves enormous credit for this legislation. It is important. We'll need a budget, and it'll be good to hear how that works out. I'd also keen to hear, I realise that this is essentially reserved legislation, but it is important that we do liaise with Wales and with Scotland, and where appropriate Northern Ireland. I appreciate that it's outside of this legislation, but no doubt they would want to know how things could be developed there too. Passenger transport is obviously a particular challenge. My noble friend, the Minister, mentioned how this is already happening in Edinburgh, and it would be good to hear the experience of that as well. And I appreciate that drones and waterborne vehicles are outside the scope of this legislation, but obviously there is work to be done there as well, and so perhaps it would be good to hear about what the government does propose in the long term in relation to those areas, whilst noting that they're not subject to this particular legislation. My Lord, safety must be paramount in this legislation. It goes without saying that's the most important thing, and no doubt we'll be looking at that in detail as the legislation passes through your Lordship's House. I think I'd be also keen to look at the sanctions, both criminal and civil, and what existing legislation we would want to make use of, and how that works in with this. And as I say, in particular, just in concluding, my Lords, I think the government deserves credit, and I trust that we're all getting behind this legislation and improving it as it passes through your Lordship's House.
My Lords, I rise to support this bill. I think it is right as a nation we should signal our acceptance of this technology, even if it is not quite yet oven-ready or mature enough to be properly rolled out at present. But we are a nation whose future will depend upon our ability to adapt and harness new technologies. So we must signal to the entrepreneurial businesses of the world that we are open for such business. Come and build here is the message we are giving, and I thoroughly approve. I also support this bill in my capacity as an occasional spokesman for both rural Britain and an ever greener Britain. It will help improve connectivity and reduce the isolation of the rural elderly, while ensuring that all generations have better access to training, work and leisure. Initially, my thinking went along the lines of each parish having a self-drive vehicle for use by its parishioners. But then I realised that you would not need to do that. You just need 2 or 3 privately owned self-drive cars which can be rented out to parishioners to go to the hospital, the shops, or even the local evening football training. All cars properly licensed, of course. Elon Musk believes that not only will these self-driving cars be 10 times safer than manual cars, but they will, in his words, develop, and I quote, massive fleet learning. He also believes that, bearing in mind that we only use our car for less than 10% of our waking hours, I'm surprised it's that much actually, that just by tapping a button we will be able to add our car to, say, the Uber 2 fleet and have it earn income for us when we are at work or on vacation. In my case, of course, that will mean I'd have to remove my golf clubs from the boot, not to mention the rubbish that always seems to accumulate in my car, but maybe it'll be worth it. But going back to my village transport, I fear that it is unlikely that, as at present, the Uber fleet, neither manual nor self-drive, will be available in most rural villages. But the existence of self-drive vehicles within a community will mean that Mrs. Smith, who owns such a car, will be able to lend out her car to her neighbours, A, without having to drive it herself, or B, having to worry about the driving skills of old Mr. Jones going to the hospital, or even young Master Jones going to the football training. And as a result, connectivity in rural areas will be dramatically improved. And believe me, after the lack of housing, the lack of public transport to shops, health services, leisure and even jobs is one of the most serious shortcomings of current rural living if your income happens to be in the lowest quartile. Now, I have to admit, and I apologise for it, that I was not able to attend the various briefing meetings that have been held in anticipation of this bill, so I may have missed something. But I have 1 or 2 very minor concerns that I don't think are touched on the bill, and they probably fall into the category of ancillary legislation that the noble Lord mentioned in his speech. They're not very serious concerns, as I say, but I hope they're worth mentioning. For instance, I think we might have to change the highway code and even the law to stop jaywalkers. In certain self-driving vehicle trials in Italy, people tended to walk out in front of automatic vehicles and behave irresponsibly, to challenge them, as it were. And I'm not quite sure what that says about the average Italian pedestrian or their current expectation of Italian driving abilities. But the point I'm making is that when we have self-drive cars on our roads, then maybe, as in the USA and Switzerland, for instance, currently, UK pedestrians should only be able to walk across urban roads, and I stress urban roads, at certain points and when permitted. We don't want early accidents undermining the success of these self-drive vehicles. And I may say I speak as an inveterate jaywalker. But on the other hand, on the assumption that all AVs will have permanently functioning all-round cameras and even black boxes, then people will soon learn everything around a self-drive car will be being recorded. You might even think twice about smacking your child near a self-drive car. There is one other aspect which occurred to me, and I don't expect an answer. It's probably, again, an ancillary matter. But there are times when one is driving along and the police wave you down and tell you that there has been an incident of some sort, and that you will either have to wait or find another route. Now, clearly a self-drive car will have no problem either waiting or finding an alternative route. But how will the policeman communicate with a self-drive car? And B, how will the self-drive car know that this is a policeman and not some random joker, troublemaker, or even car thief? As I said, neither of my concerns represent insurmountable problems. But finally, my lords, I have an extra reason to support this bill, and that is to be hoped that it will encourage the development of the same self-drive technology in other fields off the road. And I realise that the noble lord has specifically excluded these from the umbrella of this bill, but I just want to state them anyway. Firstly, I have long had this vision of all farming in the world, but particularly on small holdings in sub-Saharan Africa, being carried out by a myriad of small, connected and automated tractors, cats, I call them, about the size of a garden tractor or smaller. They are beginning to be developed, and these cats hopefully will soon be nurturing the crop in their field carefully, day and night, using their own artificial intelligence and awareness of the weather forecasts, with not only the minimal use of sprays and fertilizers, and produce a crop without the need for the farmers themselves to be expensively trained, because that expensive training is in sub-Saharan Africa the major blockage to optimal food production. And of course the other area for AVs is on the high seas. Rolls-Royce are on record as saying that a greater use of autonomous marine vessels could save the global marine industry up to £80 billion per annum from potential reductions in capital costs, manning costs and fuel costs. But all that, of course, is in the future and, as the noble lord said, not particularly relevant to this bill, even if the technology implicit in this bill is what is going to make it happen. So I will just conclude by repeating that I thoroughly approve of the bill, and I look forward to us all ironing out the inevitable potential problems as we take it forward.
My Lords, I'd first like to declare my interest as an officer of the APPG on self-driving vehicles and a business lifetime in the vehicle industry. I'm also the father of a son with learning difficulties who could certainly benefit, like many disabled people can, from these vehicles. And I'm also have been the chairman of the Greenwich Trial Technical Committee, where I can reassure my friend Lord Cameron that those in that trial, those pedestrian school children who thought it was useful to leap out in front of the autonomous vehicle to see if it stopped, after they had tried it 2 or 3 times and it had stopped, they found the whole experience extremely boring and stopped taunting the vehicle in this way. So in fact, it was perfectly safe. My Lords, this is an enabling bill to enable what I hope is a great industry. We can't be certain about the future, of course, but we can be fairly certain about the present. The present state of cars cannot be optimum. They're driven badly by humans. Humans who get bored, smoke, chat, or argue with their family, get drunk, and certainly produce urban pollution by accelerating too fast and braking too hard. Computers will be better drivers because they have more varied input than humans and much better ability to concentrate on the problems. The question of the moment is, when did you last enjoy driving? Was it when traffic was less, when there were less bicycles and bus lanes? Would we enjoy driving more in an autonomous vehicle? My Lords, this bill is quite wide in its power to demand information, and the danger is only that too much information is delivered. If the department gets terabytes of data following an accident, will it realistically be able to cope? There are people working on digital commentary systems, systems that tell the listener what is being observed and why the vehicle is doing something, systems which are analogous to the way of teaching a young driver to improve by getting them to comment on their driving decisions. It will depend on the detailed decision process how much useful information comes out, but it certainly can be considered. The alternative is that, following an accident, somebody issues terabytes of data and we're no further forward in working out how to stop other vehicles with other systems repeating the accident. That happens now because human drivers are very fallible at remembering their own faults. In general, the sooner we can get this bill into law, the better.
It's my pleasure to take part in this debate, and I declare an interest as a member of the all-party AV group, and I'm also grateful for so many of members from the industry who came and briefed us last week. I think we also need to thank the House of Lords Library, who produced a very comprehensive summary of what the issues are, and of course then the Law Commission, who spent 4 years looking at it, and I think it's a really good bill, and it's going to help us a lot, as many noble lords have told us. It's going to be good for the concept of who's in charge. I like this idea of a user in charge. I think that's a really important issue, but given the fact that I think the bill's got 77 clauses, it's going to take some studying when we get to committee stage. And I think one of them, the issues, is going to be, as one or two noble lords have said, the question of interfaces between when you're on automatic mode, if I can call it that, when you're not on that, where you are when it happens, and who else gets involved or shouldn't do. The noble Lord Cameron talked about the importance of having some self-drive capability, especially in the country, and he's absolutely right. To some extent, we could be using scooters or electric bikes. Self-drive cars probably have the benefit of being more weather resistant than my electric scooter or my electric bike or anything else, but the idea of individual transport is something which we seem to have talked about a lot at the moment.
Yep.
And it has to be good for everyone, efficient, convenient, and a good investment. I'd like to spend a few minutes just talking about safety, as the noble Lord the Minister said in his excellent introduction. Safety was very important, but like all things which are sort of mechanical, when they come into contact with pedestrians, cyclists or other non-motorised users, the safety debate probably gets a little bit unfair. The AVs are probably going to be able to be better than humans to avoid collisions with other motor vehicles, but when it comes to the humans on the road, or cyclists or whatever, I think there's a few questions that we need to address. I was impressed by the background briefing which noble lords would have received for the King's speech quite recently, that set out the requirements which came from the Law Commission, that, and I quote, "only vehicles that can drive themselves safely and can follow all road traffic rules without the need for a human to monitor or control the vehicle will be classified as self-driving and allowed on our roads." And then it carries on to say, and I quote, "companies will have to meet safety requirements from the point of a vehicle introduced onto our roads or face new sanctions and penalties." Now, we then come to the definition of what is safe. What are the safety principles that noble Lord the Minister mentioned? And we're told that road safety in Great Britain is better as a result of the use of authorised automatic vehicles on roads than it would otherwise be. Now, my Lords, I would challenge that. Our road safety record in this country, I'm sure we'll go into this at committee stage, is a lot worse than many other countries. It's not as good as it's worse than Sweden. Sweden had a target about 10 years ago of not having any road deaths at all in a year. Well, it hasn't got there, but it's still better than us. And so we have to somehow get this safety rule better defined, and I'm sure I shall have some amendments when it comes to it. But it's also a question of where we do it, because I think if one is driving up a motorway or your vehicle is going up a motorway, that's probably quite a good place to start the trial, because there will be no pedestrians or cyclists, hopefully, on the motorway. And I expect that's one of the things that's been happening quite well in the United States until recently. But then, when you get to narrow roads, maybe Lord Cameron's village, I don't know, or in towns and cities, it's going to get very, very much more difficult. And I think I'm not going to read out my definition of safety now, because that'll come at committee stage, but I think we can do a great deal better and have a target of making our road safety even better than it is at the moment. And when it comes to regulation, or how this is going to be policed and enforced, I recall a long time ago proposing an amendment to some transport bill which suggested that the Office of Road and Rail should be doing just that, and that the Office of Road and Rail should be responsible for road safety as well as rail safety. It does a very good job on rail safety, as we all know. It's not allowed to do much on road safety because that's thought to be either the Department of Transport's role or the police's role or something. But they have a technical expertise which I think is well worth looking at, and it would be quite nice if we had a sort of consistent structure between these various transport modes, and I include air as well as rail and road and sea, that we have a safety regulator and separately an accident investigation branch which also does a blame-free investigation. And I think we've got a lot to learn from these other ones, and to bring in a bit of consistency, my Lords, I think would be really good. And finally, my Lords, I'd like to ask the Minister how this bill and what we're aiming to do compares with what's happened on the continent, France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Spain, wherever. Are we ahead? Are we behind? And if I want to drive my car to France, will it work in France on AV mode if it was an AV in this country? Or have we got a long way to go? I look forward to his comments and certainly look forward to this bill's passage through the House.
My Lord, it's a great pleasure to follow the noble Lord Berkeley, and particularly because it was he who encouraged me to take part in this debate. And I first of all acknowledge that the concept of self-driving vehicles is an exciting technology with considerable advantages and implications for distribution, deliveries, public and personal transport, and of course is partly the reason why 5G rollout is an object of government policy. So to get ahead of that, we obviously need legislation and a framework for the future. I must commend the All-Party Parliamentary Group for its work on this and setting out what I thought was a very useful shopping list of criteria, and I found that most helpful. Now, my Lords, any policy in this area must, of course, consistently apply core principles, or it will fail, which is why Part 1 of the bill is so important.
But before the government gets too misty-eyed over the seductive technology and the benefits claimed by protagonists, I would just like to suggest a slight reality check, but also in the hope that someone will tell me that there are answers to all my reservations. Firstly, my lords, there are some claims made for AVs which I would respectfully challenge. One is that AV technology is greener, but it transpires on closer examination that this is largely hypothecated on the use of battery electric vehicles, a development that already exists and not itself intrinsic to self-driving vehicles. Another is that it may be expected to reduce congestion. And on that too, I have to say I'm not entirely convinced. Even in a fully digitised, connected and traffic management ordered world, peaks of congestion, unplanned events, inadequate capacity and progressive devotion of urban road space to other priorities are likely to persist even if the numbers of vehicles are reduced. However, the idea of instantly directing and approaching vehicles away from traffic incidents would be extremely welcome and I'm sure would benefit emergency service. That said, if the traffic jam avoiding algorithms of some of the more hyperactive sat-nav systems are any indication, and I've used a few, significant additional road miles by way of diversion through previously quiet residential streets may be one rather negative outcome. My lords, the AVs that replace conventional ones may, of course, also be on the road for longer hours. So there are numerous other factors to be considered before some of the claims are, to me, entirely credible. And safety, referred to by the noble Lord Berkeley, seems to me at least partly a factor of road design as opposed to the intrinsic error of the human. Now, secondly, I believe it's an acknowledged fact that for an extended period of time, possibly several decades, there will be AVs with artificial intelligence and smart centres and conventional vehicles driven by fallible mortals all sharing the same space. And this was referred to by the noble Lord Tunnicliffe. And this requires an artificial intelligence that can cope with the irrational. Now, I'm a driver. That's the only interest I need to declare for this purpose. And I can usually tell if a motorist in front of me or in another lane is distracted, looking for a destination, diffident or nervous, likely to pull in or cut in or pull out with little warning, or just plain aggressive. However, if I live long enough to be a driver faced with general AV use, I'd like a visual warning of the fact so that I can make due allowance. Maybe a little flashing light would do that job for me. Thirdly, there is the technology itself, which, leaving the matter of 5G rollout to one side, still has some way to go in my view. Now, I drive a vehicle that has certain automated assistance functions. Noble lords will be familiar with these. It has an automatic braking system, which I cannot disable. So, a bit like a flighty horse, it's liable to screech to a halt for a plastic bag blowing across the road in front, or for an uneven roadside curb, or even pedestrian railings on a bend. It will only be a matter of time before another driver goes into the back of me because of this. It also warns me fairly frequently that this function has become inoperative due to external conditions. It didn't react to a deer that crossed the road immediately in front of me on the A24 the other night, which I did hit a glancing blow. The lane change warning is, however, something I can disable. It takes the form of a rather unnerving wobble in the steering, which could, of course, to an experienced driver, mean other things. On sat-nav, I frequently find the speed limit, road priorities, and even roads and junctions themselves haven't been updated despite a recent software download. And sometimes the system doesn't even know where I am for admittedly short but potentially critical periods. There's one particular junction on the M25 that's like that. So I predict it will be some considerable time before the communications network is robust and comprehensive enough and has adequate reserve capacity, and emergency capacity in particular, for general AV use. So for a while, I suspect that greater differentials will arise between those areas where AVs can be used successfully and those where they cannot, and I think we shouldn't be blind to that. And of course, there's the issue of suitability, for which Clause 1(3) of the bill refers to in terms of the vehicle credentials. But it should also take account of the road environment in which these vehicles operate, which is often of very variable quality, And whereas AV may operate successfully somewhere, for instance, like Milton Keynes, on a coherently designed and well-constructed street layout, but get to, say, the rural West Country, an area that I sort of part-time share with the Noble Lord Cameron of Dillington, and it's obviously a rather different matter. So even without a raised road marking, signage hidden behind vegetation or too dirty to read, the odd failed traffic light, roads with hidden potholes, and anything but conventional width, and no doubt with the Noble Lord Cameron will understand this when I say with or without large farm vehicle usage on narrow lanes, and no 5G or indeed any G at all, and there are potential limits to where AVs may be safely used apart from the general competency of the vehicle itself. I don't see this expressed clearly in Part 1 of the bill. But while on that subject, I note a peculiarity in the definition of a road, which in 2021 was the subject of a legal case in respect of the Isle of Wight, and caused me to contemplate the question of private roads where street view does not penetrate and may have novel street finishes, furniture, strange demarcation, and so on. Two recent road schemes on public roads near my home are clearly defective. One is affected by appalling visibility for traffic approaching from the right, and the other has a staggered junction, a new staggered junction of such appalling geometry that you cannot negotiate it without seriously cutting the corner. Now that doesn't matter if you're in a smart car, but it does matter if you're in a delivery truck. And I entirely take the point made in an email I received from the cycling lobby that their members, plus of course the elderly on scooters, pedestrians and pets, deer, foxes, badgers and preferably hedgehogs as well, need to be recognisable by this evolving technology. And I have a particular worry expressed by other noble lords about this hybrid driver in control who is nonetheless able to allow automation to take over subject to immediate human intervention where necessary. I sense this may become a commonplace halfway house, which is why I mention it when other lords have also done so. Now, I'm not a behavioural scientist, but I do wonder how quickly human attention returns to effective and possibly emergency reaction if, given conventional distractions inside or outside the vehicle, focus has wandered elsewhere once automation has taken over. And avoiding danger is often a matter of intuitive prediction and behavioural clues, not always achieved in the last resort by sensors suddenly deciding they're going to apply the brakes. Finally, my lords, a cautionary tale. In a previous attempt to improve highway capacity and safety, the government invested in, noble lords will know this, smart motorways. But seemingly in an effort to reduce costs, it decided to omit the safety camera system designed to detect vehicles stopped in the slow lane, and with, sad to say, tragic consequences. Now, I myself am no longer happy simply to allow government driven by the politics of presentation and balancing of finance, possibly in priority to safety, a completely free hand in such matters. And I would want to see an entity with a comprehensive focus, independent status and determination equivalent to something like the Health and Safety Executive to have oversight of how this technology is rolled out. I'm not clear that the bill adequately deals with that. Therefore, whilst welcoming AV technology and the necessity of this bill, which I do, I don't see it as addressing all the essential aspects. And there are a lot of caveats to this with critical elements that will be left to subsequent regulation. So I would simply suggest proceeding with some caution, lest we act in haste only to repent later at leisure.
My Lords, I welcome this bill and it's a pleasure to take part in this second reading debate. In doing so, I declare my technology interests as advisor to Boston Limited. Can I start by congratulating the Law Commission on their excellent work on this bill. They have done a significant suite of work across many new technologies and delivered bills and commentary and reports to Parliament, all of excellent quality, and long may that continue. It enables us to have better initial legislation and really have a sense of some of the depth and breadth of the issues involved when we try and make optimum use and deployment of all of these new technologies that we currently have in our human hands. My Lords, I'd like to touch on 5 principles, those of safety, transparency, accessibility, public engagement and power usage. Firstly, to safety. It seems a useful discipline that one, before embarking upon any programme of automation or autonomous delivery, should consider what can be done to improve the current situation. The government state that the overriding objective here is better, safer journeys. Well, what can currently be done with what we currently have? If I may, a number of examples which I'd welcome my noble friend the Minister's comments on when he comes to wind up our debate. Firstly, e-scooters. What do they add to safer, better journeys? What do they add to a healthier population? They certainly don't take cars out of the mix for the kind of journeys they'll use. So what's the government's current position when it comes to further e-scooter experiments? And what role do they think that e-scooters play in a multiple, accessible, safe, healthy transport ecosystem? Secondly, there's been an extraordinary spike since COVID of cars and vehicles shooting red lights, even those on pedestrian crossings. So with very minimal technology investment, in fact the cameras may very well be there on many of these crossings and lights, would my noble friend the Minister agree that government and local authorities should look to those cameras and that evidence to clamp down and put an end to cars shooting through red lights as if red has suddenly become a soft amber to simply sail through? And can my noble friend the Minister confirm that in major cities such as London, these crossings are all likely to be currently monitored through the main transport control centre, such as Palestra, when it comes to the London situation? Similarly, so-called shared space, which achieves nothing by a planning folly to take away all road markings, all crossings, all traffic lights, all signage, and put cars and pedestrians, tankers and toddlers in that so-called shared space. What's the government's position on existing shared space schemes? How are they helping to deliver the rightly set out overriding objective of safer, better, more accessible journeys? The Minister stated in his introduction, and it's in the notes to the bill, that autonomous vehicles won't be distracted. Well, that's certainly true if one considers distraction from a human perspective, but what about all the things that can easily confuse, make the system not work as intended, and have, sometimes as been seen in other jurisdictions, tragic consequences? What has the government made of the evidence from experiments around the world? I'll just draw on one example from California, where it was reported in evidence that 40 incidents of autonomous vehicles interfering with emergency service vehicles have been recorded. Does my noble friend the Minister think this is a high number, a low number? What are the consequences? What analysis has the government made of that evidence, and how has that fed in to the bill which is currently before us? In short, on safety, what is the government's ambition? What is the safety ambition when it comes to autonomous vehicles? And to put it at its most extreme, and may I say in no sense do I advocate for this, nor even suggest it, but if we were to reach a situation where it was evidentially proven that autonomous vehicles with no user in charge were significantly safer than human drivers, would the government then move to ban human driving? I merely put that in that does seem a logical conclusion of the arguments which are set out in much of the documentation around the bill. Turning to transparency, will the data that's gathered in all of these experiments be available, be open for third parties to analyse, to consider and to look at? Transparency is critical if we're going to have increasing engagement, comfort and confidence in these new technologies. Will the government look to have accredited third-party professionals to review, to opine and to accredit these systems much more than the vehicles themselves? And as set out in the bill, it's said that there'll be an ongoing review of the vehicles. I'd say more vehicles and the software and indeed the technologies. How regular is that review to be? Because it would seem for it to be optimal, it needs to be real time, it needs to be second by second. And what learnings have the government taken from other industries, such as the airline industry and the approach that Rolls-Royce take with its sensational Trent engines? What learnings are there to be had? Turning to accessibility and inclusion, can my noble friend the Minister confirm that all and every development in this AV space will be inclusive by design? Because if it is, that will resolve so many of the issues of access, of equality, which will otherwise impact later down the track. And again, what learnings have been taken from many of the rollouts, not least in San Francisco, when it comes to accessibility? In terms of the experiments in this country, have disabled people been involved? To what extent and in what way? And what plans do the government have to ensure the disabled people are involved, and indeed the whole diversity of people are involved through every level and stage of this experimentation, development and deployment? Building on that point, in terms of broader public engagement, if we're to achieve the optimum outcomes from any of these new technologies, public engagement is absolutely critical. And we've seen examples from the past where public engagement has been good, the technology has been taken on and largely melts into the background and just becomes a positive part of our everyday lives, and indeed vice versa. So what's been done so far by the government to have meaningful public engagement across the country when it comes to autonomous vehicles, and what's the plan to further push for, from my point of view, dramatically increased public engagement to ensure that we take people on all of these at every stage autonomous journeys? My Lords, turning to power usage, what analysis have the government undertaken in terms of the impact on the grid? It's pretty clear that this is going to be part of the electrification of our transport provision, but how is that going to roll out? We can currently achieve all of our mobility needs with but 15% of the existing fleet. So how will the government ensure that by bringing autonomous vehicles on stream, that won't simply add more vehicles to the road, more congestion and more difficulties? What's the plan to ensure that there's substitution and increased use, multiple usage of AVs rather than simply this being additive? And alongside that, where does the government see the power source to come for this? And where will that energy come from? Because as already been noted, electric vehicles are only as green as the fuel that powers them. Do we currently have the resources that we need? Do we currently have a plan for long duration energy storage? When it comes to the batteries in vehicle, Do we have resilience of supply? Where are we prepared to look, to develop, to get the battery technologies from? Are we looking to still have a potential UK sovereign battery production? In conclusion, my lords, I welcome the bill, but like all bills, it will benefit from some work. But if we can, by the time the bill leaves us, have something which really does move us forward in terms of better journeys, smarter journeys, more accessible, more inclusive journeys, well, who wouldn't want to get on board?
Richmond, not just for his general thought-provoking comments, but also specifically for those around accessibility, and I have been able to cut out a couple of paragraphs I was going to start with. I just do want to declare my past interest as a member of the Lords Select Committee on the Equality Act and the impact on disabled people, which included assessing PSV transport regulations for safe and effective travel for disabled people. It must be right that the future of sustainable motoring lies with autonomous vehicles, and this bill, despite many of the issues that have been raised so far this afternoon, is a welcome first step to addressing how driving will change and what regulations will be needed to ensure that people, passengers and pedestrians are safe. I will focus my time on just two specific interests that concern me. The first is on data protection, and I'm very grateful for the comments made by my noble friend Lady Bowles earlier on. I want to go into a very specific area, though. In Part 1, Chapter 3, the bill sets out the collection and sharing of information in relation to autonomous vehicles. And whilst it's important that data is collected to understand how services and the vehicles operate, can I ask the Minister what protections for personal data are proposed to ensure that any data collected is ring-fenced and can only be used by the relevant parties in a pseudonymised form? The nature of the data collection of automated vehicles, whether PSVs or not, mean that a far wider range of organisation would have legitimate access to that data. However, the collection of this data will be much more detailed than current systems, and I cite Uber as an example there, where the company, Uber, the driver, and the passenger who has booked the ride all share data between them. But that's not as much as is being proposed within this Act. There's a significant amount of data that will be shared back for learning about how automated vehicles will work. Now, one of the points I'm interested in is whether the government would have access to that data, and would that also be ring-fenced specifically for transport purposes and not made available either to other departments or to other public bodies. For example, the Home Secretary and the police have asked in 3 bills recently that I'm aware of for access to personal confidential data, health data and other data of individuals. And through amendment, we've managed to ring-fence that to real need of it rather than just automatically the right to collect it. And I think this ought to be considered here too in this bill. And will organisations collecting the data be permitted to sell on some or all of that data for commercial purposes? And if so, will there be safeguards to ensure that none of the identifiable individual data will be sold other than through pseudonymised or truly anonymised formats? My second issue relates to disabled and vulnerable passengers and people, and I'm sure Lord Borwick was right to say this bill is an opportunity for disabled travellers, but there are also some concerns, some of which Lord Holmes outlined earlier. The bill rightly talks about the importance of the safety of passengers in terms of an automated vehicle. And by disabled and vulnerable people, I mean the full range of those who, like myself, use a wheelchair, through to an elderly person who needed assistance, whether just a handle in the right place in a vehicle or more safety, get in and out when there isn't anybody else to assist them. Can the Minister say if the designs of all automated vehicles will address the needs of disabled and vulnerable passengers? It's very difficult and expensive to get an electric wheelchair accessible vehicle, WAV, at the moment, mainly because the automotive companies put the large batteries at exactly where the adjustments are made to install a ramp and securing services for a wheelchair. Now, if this bill is heralding a new approach to building vehicles, then accessibility needs to be built in right from the start too, and not by exception, by the norm. That way, disabled people will not have to pay over the odds for journeys that others just take for granted. Let me give you an example from another sector. Habinteg, the housing charity, has actually costed up how much it costs to design a house for a lifetime rather than it having to be adapted as people get older. And we are living in a society where that demographic is happening rapidly. It is a minute cost of the initial cost, but the facility of all homes thereafter built that way mean that people don't have to move into other places or spend tens of thousands of pounds for the most basic things. This brings me on to my second area of concern. Clause 83 disapplies taxis, private hire vehicles and bus legislation. The explanatory memorandum says this is insofar as a permit holder is providing an automated passenger service in areas and vehicle types specified in the permit. Now, my concern is that much of the disability equality regulations in transport might be covered by that exemption. Now, I understand that there needs to be a different approach to regulation for automated vehicles, but can the Minister tell me how disabled passengers will be able to retain their rights under law to safe and effective travel? So can I give you one example just to illustrate that point? The PSV regulations on bus drivers gives the driver the power to enforce the priority of wheelchair users over buggies, children's buggies, or even people who refuse to move out of the wheelchair space. That is the only place that it is held. So if PSV regulations are disapplied, how will we ensure that disabled passengers will have the right to use spaces that they have now? In Part 6, Clause 93, there is a discussion about real-time traffic information for automated vehicles, including bus lanes, roadworks and diversions. The explanatory memorandum says that this information would also be available to other electronic equipment users by vehicles on roads. But this raises the issue of a disabled passenger, could be visually impaired, could be in a wheelchair, or just very frail, who suddenly finds their PSV automated vehicle has been diverted, but without a human driver, doesn't know where to get on or off. Believe me, it's hard enough when buses are suddenly diverted and you have to work out where you're going to, whether the new drop-off space is on a pavement wide enough, but the drivers are there and able to be helpful. So without a driver, my lords, what would happen? The Select Committee on the Equality Act 2010, the impact on disabled people, also commented on street scenes that Lord Holmes referred to, and how disabled pedestrians, especially but not only those with visual impairment, struggle with very little separation between road and pavement. Clause 93 of this bill covers the provision, also covers street scene. And can I ask the Minister how automated vehicles, both PSV and private, will be programmed to watch out for disabled pedestrians who may not be able to see? This is a different point to the one that Lord Cameron of Dillington was making about jaywalkers. I'm talking about people who actually may not be able to see and may not get the information that an automated vehicle is approaching them. And here I just want to briefly quote the Noble Lord Holmes of Richmond from his 2015 report, Accident by Design. He said at the end of that, "There is an urgent need for an immediate moratorium on shared space until there is more and better evidence about the impact of such schemes, including an improved record of accident data and better understanding of the consequences of people literally designed out of these spaces." End of quote. That's not just relevant to today's shared spaces, but to this bill as a whole. It would be a real missed opportunity not to include safe disabled provision by design for a new age of automated vehicles. And I do hope the Minister will be able to answer my questions, but I also wonder if he might be prepared to meet with myself, Lord Holmes, and a couple of disability organisations to ensure the consideration that he outlined, to ensure the rights and needs of disabled people are not left out of legislation, planning and building in the future.
Lords, I'm sure I speak for all colleagues in the Chamber, that this debate's been enhanced by the contribution the Baroness Brinton and my noble friend Lord Holmes. The area they covered is so important. I myself want to record in Hansard that today is an auspicious day for British transport, because today a jet took off from London Airport on using synthetic fuels to fly to the States. That is a huge achievement of the United Kingdom and our development, our work, our taxpayers' money that has brought that about. And I'd like to record that in the context of this particular bill.
Yeah.
I also, some 60 years ago, plus, was a fast jet pilot. In those days, safety was absolutely paramount. If you were there at the controls on your own, flying at anything up to 40,000 feet, with a speed of up to 0.82 Mach, you had to know what was happening. There was only one person who made the decision. There were plenty of instruments that were reflecting the actions you were taking. And so when I was preparing for this particular bill, I was reminded of 3 fatal crashes that have occurred thanks to automation. I'm sure colleagues will remember them. The Boeing 737 MAX B on October 2018, 189 people killed. 2 pilots totally unable to do anything to stop the automation and the stall that followed. March 2019, same aircraft, not the same one, but the same model, 157 killed. What went wrong? Failure of software. Now, we fight with software all the time, but failure of software when you've got passengers can and has been proven to be very difficult. I had a look at the French one because I remembered that one in the Caribbean, because I knew it was different to Boeing. The situation there was a weather condition. That particular flight was on June the 1st, 2019, as that plane headed towards a thunderstorm. The pitot head froze. That's the measurement in the front of the aircraft that measures the speed of the aircraft and the height of the aircraft. It froze. Net result, the instruments recorded inaccurately what the status of the aircraft was, and the aircraft froze, the aircraft stalled, and all the passengers were killed. So that's where I'm coming from in relation to this bill, where, as is stated, safety is at its core. Now let's turn to leave the airline world and go on to the implications for drivers. The lessons learned from those aircraft crashes are: 1, drivers must be trained. Now it's quite a challenge, and we've listened today. We know there's a whole variety of abilities on the driving on the road today. So I don't know the answer to that question, other than it's a question that has to be asked. Then there are what they call uncommanded activations. That's software that suddenly says something to you when you haven't put it into the program, or you didn't think you put it into the program, and you have to decide what to do. So that's the partial one that's a challenge. And then there are the potential alerts that if you're half in control or not in control, are those alerts recognised or not? And fourthly, as I've already indicated, weather conditions. Now, weather conditions do change dramatically in our country. Heavy frost in Bedfordshire day before yesterday. All the instruments on the car had to be cleaned down, so that, particularly on the car I've driven here today, I had to clear the camera for the reversing thing. So weather conditions do affect things. We also know from the very good reference book from briefing from the library, the history of California at this point in time. And we recognise, and we need to recognise, the states are way ahead of us. They've been doing it that much longer. Well, they've had what they call these vehicles going round San Francisco. But we see on one of the paragraphs, the head of the fighting services, emergency services, says that 40 times since 2020, the firefighting services said that driverless cars had interfered with their work. And then there is another paragraph about San Francisco, which is very relevant. Any of us that have been to San Francisco know it's all uphill, down, down. There are examples of where cars have run through the red lights, crashed into a bus, blocked pedestrian crossings and cycle lanes and caused traffic jams, etc. Now, and then one final one, the California Department of Motor Vehicles states on the 10th of November, earlier this month, 673 autonomous vehicle collision reports. Well, with safety as primary for this legislation, that's not a very, very good start, is it? So now we turn, if I may, to the bill itself. And I'm not going to go through the varying stages that have taken part already. But 7 years have gone by. And that's quite a long time before we get round to this particular bill. And here we are, after 7 years. The fact of the matter is, we as a country have fallen behind. We were in the vanguard 7 years ago. We're not in the vanguard anymore. We're in the guard's van, almost, in terms of the technical development, etc. So, we ought to make sure that we know what other people have done so far before we start spending a lot of government money on just mirroring tests that others have done. And I think that's a very important point, I believe. And I'd like to know from my noble friend, not necessarily this evening, but in writing, how much have we spent already on this project by the taxpayer? So, what about the context for authorised automated vehicles? Well, who ensures that those vehicles actually stick to the restrictions that apparently some of them have given? So if the restriction is to the motorway, who's going to ensure that it still does stick to the motorway or not? I don't know the answer. And what is the cost, the estimated cost, of the updating of the digital information across the whole of the road network in GB? I mean, we talk about that, and it was in my neighbour friend's opening statement that all applied to GB. Well, we certainly haven't got that digital information at this point in time. What work's being done on the current driving test? I have a granddaughter who's studying the highway code and everything else, having driving lessons. That age group, those young people, at what point are they going to be brought in so that at least the highway code is brought up to date? And for me, Clause 2 at the moment is really pie in the sky, because the principles must be framed with a view to securing that road safety in Great Britain will be better as a result of the use of authorised automated vehicles on the road. Well, what do I see today, driving down this morning? Well, I don't know exactly how many cars there are on the road, but can't be far short of 1 million. Then there are hundreds of lorries. Then there are possibly millions of cyclists, few of whom know what the highway code is. We've only got to see what happens out the front here. They don't stop at that pedestrian crossing with a red light. They just cycle right through it. Then there are the delivery bikes. Very creative motorcyclists, but they weave in and out. Then there are the scooters, they too. And believe it or not, in Bedfordshire, the week before last, the driver who is taking me back tonight said to me, "You won't believe this, Michael," he said, "but there was a motorised skateboard overtook me the other day in the 20 mile an hour." And he said, and I asked, "Oh, God, I believe it." And Barry says, "Not just that," he said, "further up, he picks up a passenger and comes back the other way." Now, these aren't even licensed, are they? But they're very, very dangerous, and I don't know where all this fits in. And finally, even the Prime Minister admits potholes. Now, I don't know whether AI can work out that if you see a big puddle, there's a pothole underneath it or not. But it is a problem. So the weather conditions do affect drivability, particularly, and potholes. Driving skills do vary, we know that. Also, in my judgment, why do we not just, for once, learn from others? So my repeated request to Her Majesty's Government is that before we go and spend too much money on it, let us find out what Germany's been doing, what Sweden's been doing, what particular states have been doing, pull that together, and then we might have the basis of a bill. But this is a 100-clause bill. I think I can tell my noble friend opposite, Lord Berkeley, there are actually 100 clauses to the bill, I think. And of course, I can see we've got to get the framework there. But just for once, I think we should be strong-minded. I was in business for years. I think if we stick to the jobs we're good at, synthetic fuels for aviation, hydrogen, electric vehicles were mentioned, we have a lot of work to do there, plenty to do to get that. But having said that, I am sceptical about the need for this bill at this time. And we're not in the vanguard. And if safety really is the core, then we should proceed very, very measuredly.
My Lords, in following the Noble Lord Naseby, I will start by reflecting on some of the safety issues that the Noble Lord raised, and particularly start by picking up a phrase the Noble Lord the Minister used in the introductory speech, saying that the introduction of self-driving cars, excuse me, the introduction of self-driving cars could mean the lack of human error saves lives, close quote. Now, of course, automation does not remove human error. It simply changes the potential site of the human error from an individual vehicle to a programming system, to an algorithm, to the control system that's applied to many vehicles. So there is the potential for one error to be multiplied many times with disastrous impacts. It also allows individual actions, say malevolent actions, to produce mass effects, as a number of noble lords have referred to in terms of what's happened simply with people running around with traffic cones in San Francisco. We are, of course, speaking just a couple of weeks after the National Cybersecurity Centre produced its 7th annual review, noting that UK critical infrastructure is at grave risk. We are potentially, by relying on this single system, multiple systems, creating a much higher critical safety risk, and indeed a resilience risk. I was this morning with the National Trust talking about climate adaptation and resilience. And we need to look at all of this in terms of our systems. If we rely on these systems, keep using them for years, what will happen to the skills of drivers should we suddenly actually need individual people to again take to the road and control vehicles? What, of course, happens, as we've seen in San Francisco, if they all suddenly stop working or indeed decide to assemble in one place? What does that do to the actual functioning of our society? Now, where I was going to start was actually at the Bonn Climate Talks, COP23 in 2017. And I recall from there was actually a near state of panic among members of the climate community, because back then in 2017, it was thought that we could see self-driving HGVs all over the place any day now. And that would potentially have massive impacts in terms of climate impacts, in that HGVs now spend a large amount of their time parked up because the drivers need rest periods, there's limited availability of drivers. If you put the self-driving into the equation, then you could potentially massively increase the climate impacts. But actually, noble lords might note that that was 2017, and there's actually much less fear now. So I really begin my contribution today by making a call for realism, for understanding what this bill is actually about, the environment in which it arrives. And I've already challenged the noble lady Baroness Penn when she was wearing the Treasury hat, because a government spokesperson did brief the Telegraph that this bill could mean that we could see self-driving vehicles on our roads by 2026, comma, if they were proved safe. Now, the noble lady Baroness Penn, being of course a skilled operator as she is, when I challenged her on this, agreed with me that yes, if they were proved safe, this would be possible. Well, I might run a 2-hour marathon if I was 30 years younger and had entirely different genetics. That's not the world that we live in. So I'm really asking for an acknowledgement of the realism of the situation as we conduct our debate as we go forward in this bill. However, I'm going to start with a positive, with a potential positive impact if we were to see self-driving vehicles, even if we were to see self-driving vehicles operating in small areas in controlled circumstances, which I think is a far more likely possibility. One study I was looking at noted that for self-driving vehicles to operate effectively, roads may need to be kept free of small debris and uneven surfaces smoothed. Now, a number of other noble lords have already referred to the current state of our roads. So let's imagine that we're going to go ahead with self-driving autonomous vehicles. Just think about what our roads might look like for the rest of us to enjoy. However, I would ask for a little bit of realism here. Do we actually have the capacity, financial or human skills or indeed machinery, to deliver roads entirely free of debris and entirely free of uneven surfaces? Because I'm afraid I do rather doubt it. And I think this raises important points raised by the noble lady Baroness Bowles that I want to highlight, that we do need to think, and this will come down to the detail of our later debate, about statistics and data. The road conditions in the US, in France, in Australia are very different to here. Can we actually extrapolate figures on safety from there and apply them here? And if we can't, how do we actually get the figures at a scale in the UK? I think that really is a terribly important point. Now, I'm not sure that anyone's directly referred to this, but it is worth noting that issue of safety, that the Transport Select Committee has looked at this in some detail. And I think we're going to have large debates on this at a later stage. Is the careful and competent human driver the right test to be applying? Improved safety is not a given in the real circumstances of our road. And as the RAC Foundation has said, when we put our lives in the hands of automated machinery, we expect it to perform to the highest standards of safety. That's an expectation people have. And we know that human beings make mistakes. And we know that as pedestrians, as cyclists, as other drivers, we make allowances for other people's mistakes. But we're not necessarily going to apply the same kind of criteria to autonomous vehicles. Now, I want to focus. I think this debate has moved as we've progressed through. A number of the early speeches were very much focused on the positive opportunities seen in autonomous vehicles. Lord Warner Aberystwyth was one of those people. But I want to address some policy points about the environmental risks of self-driving or autonomous cars. If we see, as a result of them, more vehicles on our road, more journeys, longer journeys, then we could see increased emissions, and I think most of us are assuming that these will be electric vehicles, but of course about half of the PM2.5, the particulate matter, small particulate matter pollution from vehicles comes from brakes and tyres, and autonomous vehicles still have brakes and tyres. There's the congestion issues, there's also the noise and the sheer disruption caused by vehicles moving around our roads. Now, there is actually some actual real data on this from partially autonomous vehicles. There was a study in California in 2019 which found that partially autonomous vehicles, their owners were taking them on longer journeys, particularly at weekends. And that makes sense when you think about it. You can put your feet up, play a computer game, read, have a sleep, and so you decide you're going to take a long weekend trip to the other end of the UK. If lots of people do that, that has a significant real environmental and social impact. There's also the risk of, let's imagine it's the theatre just up the road. Lots of people decide they're going to, well, they've got an autonomous vehicle and it costs heaps to park in the city, but you don't need to park an autonomous vehicle. You get it to drive you to the theatre, you send it home again, and then you call it when you want to leave in the evening. Can noble lords think about what Charing Cross Road might look like under those circumstances? What kind of chaos, what it might do to the buses? And finally, an issue that no one else has raised and I think is really important, and we need to look at it in many areas beyond simply autonomous vehicles. There's a temptation to think of the cloud, to think of algorithms, as this being an immaterial, something that happens out there in the cloud with no real-world physical consequences. But actually, we can thank researchers from MIT, an article that was published in the IEEE microjournal, Sudhakar et al., that actually calculated what impact using the data, processing the data, using the algorithms, what the environmental cost of that could be. And, noble lords, forgive me, I'm going to put some large numbers in a second. Data centres now produce about 0.3% of global climate change emissions. That's the same as Argentina. The MIT study would show that if you had, basically the world went to autonomous vehicles, 1 billion autonomous vehicles in the world, that demand for energy for those data centres would double. If an autonomous vehicle has 10 deep neural networks processing the images from 10 cameras, and it drives for 1 hour a day, it has to make 21.6 million inferences each day. 1 billion vehicles means 21.6 quadrillion influences. To put that into perspective, all of Facebook's data centres now make a few trillion inferences a day. 1 quadrillion is 1,000 trillion. Take the numbers away, and there is a huge demand for energy, for computing power, for all of the technology, the computers, the databases. Where are we going to find the capacity in the world to deliver that when we still have children in Africa who don't have a light bulb at night to do their homework from, where we still have areas of India that need the most basic levels of infrastructure? We need to look at all of this in this policy context. Now, I've got 2 other points I want to bring up. Lord Cameron of Dillington made what I think was a really disturbing suggestion. We might have to bring in anti-jaywalking laws to allow for autonomous vehicles. My lords, what is our economy and society for? Are we here to serve the needs of people, or are we all here to service the machines? I think that's a question the noble lord's point really does raise. And just one other point that the noble Lord Tennycliffe raised that I think was an important issue that might be seen as is explicitly excluded from the scope of this bill. But the noble lord referred to delivery vehicles that we've seen examples of, and indeed drones as well, autonomous systems that may not use the roads but that multinational companies see replacing human beings and delivering on using lots of our public spaces, the air and the pavements. Can the noble lord, the minister, tell us now, or perhaps by letter later, I understand it might not be in the briefing, what the government's plans are, what the government's thinking is about ensuring regulation of those, which brings me to just finally to reinforce the points about the need for all of this to be inclusive by design made by both the Noble Lady Baroness Brinton and the Noble Lord Holmes. We need to think about how all of our streets and pavements and airspace works for people, not for the benefits of multinational companies and their machines.
My Lords, it's a pleasure to speak after the Noble Baroness. Before I come to my main remarks, I have a question for my noble friend arising from something he said in the course of his introductory speech. He referred to the scope of the bill covering England, Scotland and Wales, and said that if these vehicles crossed the border into Northern Ireland, then they wouldn't benefit from the provisions of the bill. And I wanted to ask him what border he was referring to, because as far as vehicle regulation is concerned, there is, as I understand it, no border, and Northern Ireland is subject to the vehicle regulations in operation in this country. Was it a slip of the tongue, or was it an implication that, in fact, autonomous vehicles, if introduced into Northern Ireland, would be subject to the laws of the undemocratically made laws of the European Union? Undemocratic, that is, as far as their application to Northern Ireland is concerned, whose people, of course, have no say in the legislature which will be making those laws. And I really would be very grateful for his elucidation on that. I'm perfectly happy to accept, of course, that it was a slip of the tongue, and that would end the whole matter. But there may be something behind it he'd like to reveal. My Lords, the substance of my remarks, however, turning to the bill itself, is, of course, a piece of work from the Law Commission, and it's essentially to do with warranty and liability and insurance, which is why I thought I would have very little to say about it that was germane to the text of the bill. But I find that most noble lords have had very little to say about those particular issues, and we have wandered, I think very properly and inevitably, into a broader debate about the desirability of automated vehicles and their consequences for other road users. And I have very great interest in that, because during much of my life I've been involved in urban design. I'm particularly interested in the urban consequences. I'm less interested in what happens on motorways and so on, but urban consequences and how our cities are shaped. And indeed I have to admit, I've been the naughty corner, no doubt, for this, that I have been a great advocate for and implementer of shared spaces, which I would characterise in very different language to that used by my noble friend Lord Holmes of Richmond and the noble Baroness Lady Brinton. So let me offer a few thoughts of my own to add to this pile of imponderables that the bill has given rise to in the course of the afternoon. And most of them do, as I say, relate to the way in which cities work. But first I will say, I do accept, on the basis of my experience of railways, that it is likely that these vehicles will be safer than vehicles driven by a human person. Anyone who doubts this would not get on a Victoria Line train, for example. They would take the Piccadilly Line on every occasion. The Victoria Line train is driven by computers. The Piccadilly Line train is driven currently, sadly, because there isn't enough money, by a human being. But which is the one that arrives with a minute interval between each train, safely, every time? Which is the one that can carry those people because of that frequency, that huge capacity on the Victoria Line, and which is the one that has 3 or 4 minutes interval between the trains, because of course that's necessary, because the driver has to stop, and they can't stop as safely as the computer-driven trains do. And I think here it's worth saying, with every possible respect to my noble friend Lord Naseby, that the comparison with aviation is not an appropriate one. Rail safety is based on the principle that if something is missing, if something goes wrong, if there's something that isn't quite right in the system, the train comes to a stop. The system stops. The electricity is cut off. whereas that cannot possibly be the basis of aviation safety. Aviation safety, and if something goes missing, you can't just stop the plane at 30,000 feet and say we're going to work out what's gone wrong. Aviation safety is all about building all the safety measures in from the outset before the plane ever takes off and making sure that they're working. It's a totally different approach, and I'm assuming that automated vehicles would operate similarly to those to the rail principle. That is, that if something was missing, if they couldn't see something, that they would stop. This might cause inconvenience, as indeed it causes inconvenience if a train on the Victoria line stops and people have to work out what's gone wrong. But it is at least a safety measure and a relatively reliable one. I'm very concerned about the point made about the consequences for streetscape made by Lord Cameron of Dillington, and indeed referred to some extent by my noble friend Lord Warwick, about jaywalking. We have spent years trying to take railings out of cities and allow people to cross streets in a more natural human sort of way, to move away from that sort of Le Corbusier dystopia that arose from separating vehicles and pedestrians at every level. It's a sort of a perpetual, unending Barbican vision of our cities. We've moved away from that. And people who want to see that in operation can go to places like Piccadilly itself, which used to be only a few years ago was a motorway, a one-way motorway with barriers all along it, and has been returned to a calm and more attractive street running two ways without all those barriers and so forth. But as the noble Lord rightly points out, the very fact that you can walk in front of an automated vehicle, confident that it will stop, is going to, the manufacturers will very quickly be saying, well, we can't be having that. We're going to have those barriers back. We're going to have designated crossing places for pedestrians, and we're going to have laws that stop them from walking out in front of the cars. Because that risk balance will have changed. I don't walk out in front of cars generally when they're moving, because I worry that they may hit me. But if I know for a certainty they're going to stop, what is to prevent me? I'll just cross the road. And it may be that doing it for fun, as Lord Warwick says, if you're a 6-year-old, pales. I mean, the fun goes out of it after 3 attempts. That may be well the case, but that isn't, of course, my circumstance. My circumstance is I'm not doing it for fun, I'm doing it to cross the road, and I shall do it exactly as I want. So with the noble Baroness Lady Bennet of Manor Castle is absolutely right to make that point. The next thing I wanted to say was about congestion and the consequences of public transport. Imagine 80 pods. I mean, not all of these cars. We're talking about these automated vehicles as if they're going to be private possessions. But of course, there's an alternative vision where automated vehicles are communally or corporately owned, and they're sort of pods. They don't belong to you. And you summon them up like an Uber, and they arrive and they take you somewhere, and then they go and park or vanish or find another passenger somewhere. That is an alternative model. Imagine 80 of those lined up, nose to tail, very safely, moving along Piccadilly from Hyde Park Corner up to Piccadilly Circus, each containing an individual passenger. And as I say, bang close to each other, because it will be very safe for the reasons I explained. 80 passengers moving up Piccadilly. What is the difference between that and a bus? A bus takes 80 passengers from one end of Piccadilly to another. Well, I know what you're going to say. You'll say that, these pods, when they get to Piccadilly Circus, they can split off and all go in different directions, and they can take you to your office or the hairdresser or wherever you want to go in that vicinity. But that illustrates really what automated vehicles are addressing, which is the last mile problem rather than the main trunk problem of transport. It is how to get that last mile from the hub that you want something to take you and to be available, but not necessarily all the way along the whole journey. Why would it be attractive to do that? Indeed, why would we encourage it to do that, given both the effects on congestion and the possible consequences of a collapse in demand for public transport? Not total collapse, but a collapse in demand for public transport. Finally, I think I'm just going to make a point about traffic lights. What is going to happen to traffic lights? And why are we still investing in them? I think it's public knowledge, I know it to be true, that Transport for London is planning to spend a very large amount upgrading its extremely comprehensive traffic light system it's rolled out over the years, which still depends on the Scoot technology, that software technology, that's been in use for at least 20 years and possibly longer. So they're thinking of spending a large amount of money upgrading those. But why would anyone ever need traffic lights? Automated vehicles don't need traffic. Traffic lights are there for people like me to look at something terrestrial in front of me, and it's green or red or orange or whatever. But if your motion is dependent on your sensing of where other vehicles are, together with a communication with a satellite at the same time, you don't need they won't read traffic lights, they won't need them. What is going to happen to traffic lights? Now, I'm against traffic lights on the whole. They're a complete misery, of course, we all know that. But they do have some uses. And, for example, the uses they do have are helping people cross the roads at junctions and things like that. So what are the consequences for all of this and for the money that we're still spending, even today, on upgrading our traffic light system if we're moving over to an automated vehicle system? I have a feeling, I'm speaking quite late in the debate, and I know there are one or two very interesting speakers to follow. I have a feeling my noble friend the Minister may not be able to deal with all of the questions that we collectively have put to him in the course of his reply. And of course, so I look forward to a more detailed response in writing to some of them, though he may be able to answer the Northern Ireland one. But I think there's a lot that might arise in committee that I hadn't actually expected, and there may be amendments that test the scope of the bill just a little bit, and I look forward to them.
It's a pleasure to follow Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle and Lord Moylan and his very entertaining speech, to be able to rise to speak to your Lordship with a real sense of optimism over a bill like this. And in doing so, I must declare an interest that my wife works for Amazon. Now, neither of us have any privileged information of operations in this sector, but I suspect that they, along with many others, will be taking a keen interest in the passage of this bill. As I said, I'm really excited about this bill. I have no expert knowledge in the field, but it is a bill that will profoundly affect us all. We're all passengers and pedestrians, and most of us are drivers, cyclists, and users of online shopping websites. As we've heard, the government forecasts that the automated vehicles sector could capture up to £42 billion by 2035. And I think in this they might be being cautious. It is also a good news story that as a nation we are so strong in this sector, the UK being a global thought leader on regulating AVs, according to Oxa. We've already heard that we need to act quickly to avoid falling behind countries that have got off the starting grid quicker than us. We are looking at a landscape where, according to the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, much of the on- and off-road logistics and road passenger transport could be automated, particularly in rural areas, with a big impact in agriculture, mining and defence as well. The utopian dream is that the automatic vehicles blend seamlessly with our traffic systems, safely and efficiently working to reduce pollution, road rage and accidents, allowing skilled workers to be deployed elsewhere. Obviously, the dystopian view of robot vehicles crashing into each other, causing gridlock and mass unemployment, while AI systems take over a post-apocalyptic dying planet. And so the main difficulty for this bill is that it's trying to legislate for so much that we don't yet understand. And I think it does a pretty good job of it. I would like some help from the Minister clarifying a few questions I have on the bill. And I need to point out I'm a layman, so I apologise if my questions seem obvious to everyone else. I'm a teacher, and always tell my students to never be afraid to ask a question if you don't understand. Because I can guarantee there are always at least two others in a room that didn't know the answer either. And I always hope that one of them isn't the Minister. Along with many others, the paramount concern I have with this bill is safety. Although the noble Lord the Minister said it is baked in, things like the suspicion that cyclists and pedestrians would disproportionately bear the brunt of casualties from the initial trials around the vehicles. And this I share Cycling UK's concern that the safety bar is too low, in that the definition of safety about vehicle travels autonomously is acceptable rather than high, and it legally travels with a very low risk. At the moment it says acceptable of a traffic infraction. Therefore, tightening up the safety element of this, I think, is vital, although I'm not sure that the Noble Lord Cameron of Dillington's idea to ban jaywalkers quite works, as I'm an inveterate jaywalker, and I will fight him on that one. Although I have to say, from my daily observations from the top deck of buses in the city, that my fellow cyclists could help themselves by not running so many red lights. My other big concern is actually who's in charge of the vehicle. The concept of user in charge seems to be the very worst of all worlds, as mentioned by my noble Lord Earl Lytton. Having a driver in the cab who may be called on at any time seems to have all the risks and costs of traditional driving with very little benefit. For we are surely aiming at the no user in charge, but here things get complicated for the layman. What is a self-driving entity, an ASDE, who will be responsible for the way the vehicle drives and meeting other regulatory obligations? Each authorised automated vehicle must have one. Every authorised ASDE is an entity, but it's not made clear, at least to me, what that is. The licence operator is described as being similar to a bus operator, but the nuts and bolts of who controls what and how aren't spelled out. A fleet's vehicle is going to be controlled by one person, like a minicab company. And if so, what checks are being made on the person's or team's competence, state of mind and health to do such a vital job? Are they going to be more like air traffic controllers? In which case, how are they trained and examined? Are they going to be subject to random alcohol and drugs tests? Will they need medicals? Perhaps the Minister could shed some light. The purpose of a safety inspector is to identify, improve the understanding of, and reduce the risk of automated vehicle incidents through conducting a safety investigation. The Marine Accident Board is cited as an example, but I'm led to believe that bus operators, certainly in London, investigate their own incidents. So is the plan to get bus operators in line with train and air operators, which is something Lord Berkeley alluded to? Self-driving vehicles need to have an accurate and up-to-date understanding of the road and know the legal parameters of the network. Traffic regulation orders will be provided via a common publication platform. Is this feasible? Will this be available to other services so that an Uber driver, for instance, can at last navigate the low-traffic neighbourhoods of Hackney to get me to my house? My lords, I realise that with automation comes the fear of unemployment, although the APPG for self-driving vehicles claims that AVs will create over 38,000 new green jobs. But I think that's a subject for another day. My lords, I'm excited by the future the bill can lead us to. Overall, I think it's a very logical and well thought out, and I look forward to hearing the Minister's comments on my various points.
My Lords, I don't have any problems in principle with this bill at all, but I look forward greatly to committee, given all the speeches I've listened to. I think we will have a lively time of it. My particular contributions are going to be on vehicle identification. Number plates clearly won't do. There are millions of infractions, lots of cars driving around with no MOT, no insurance, some that are completely untraceable. We can't rely on that system when it comes to automated vehicles. And automated vehicles anyway need a different kind of identification. They need to communicate a lot. They will need to include that identity in their communication. And as the noble Baroness Lady Bennet of Manor Castle said, we can't let ourselves be hacked in that system. It will need to be baked into the hardware. Therefore, we will need a set of standards, international standards, to do it. And I really emphasise to my noble friend the importance of being in the lead on international standards. It really gives you a grip on an industry. If you look at what's happened in telecommunications, when I was young, we had GEC and Plessy, and we were top of the world. We've lost that now. And one of the reasons we didn't manage to hold on to even a bit of it is we let the whole business of standards slip. And it was no longer important. The work we were doing on standards in this country was no longer thought to be important, was no longer given emphasis, and therefore people in this country really did not have a grip on what was going on and where the industry was moving. Standards are absolutely the core of this, and we really should put effort into the standards that are going to be embedded in automated vehicles, for they are many and they are really important, and identification is very much one of them. As the Noble Lord Cameron of Dillington said, interaction with the police, and my noble friend Lord Naseby expanded that to the emergency services generally, is going to rely a lot on communication. Policemen must have a way of talking to an automated vehicle. Automated vehicle is going to want to make sure that's a policeman. This is a two-way system. At the base of it are standards. It is really important that the government gets this right. I also hope, in the course of the bill, to address to make sure that where we have a system of automated vehicles for general hire, that the information on what vehicles are where and what they will cost is available universally to customers. We should not get in a system where people are confined to the particular operators that they may have the app for. They ought to be able to have access to universal information. The whole area of data is going to be important. As my noble friend Lord Holmes of Richmond said, we really need to have access to all the data so that we can understand what's going on, and we really make sure that we are into a self-improving system and we are not developing areas of dystopia. But at the same time, you've got commercial confidentiality and value in the data. We're going to need the governance of the data is going to be really important. Also, in the short term, most of these vehicles will charge at a depot, but that won't last. They're going to want to use public charging stations. So we've got to look ahead. We've got to be part of developing a standard for how an automated vehicle can charge any old where. And then we're going to have to start putting those charging stations in well ahead of actual demand. So, again, thinking ahead, standards. To delight the noble Lord Berkeley, I think we ought to look at automated vehicles on rail. If you look at what's happening in the periphery of a network, the sort of place I live, a train every half an hour is not an efficient use of a dedicated corridor. If you had automated vehicles running in the same space, they could run when people wanted them to run. They could just be there, and you would get on when you arrived at the station, and it would stop at the station that you wanted it to stop at. You start to get a much more efficient system of transporting using a space we already have, and one which is free of humans and cyclists, and is much easier to program for. Not saying it would do on the core network, but it would absolutely do on the peripheral network, and would be a really efficient way of reviving redundant rail lines, because for them you wouldn't even need to install rails. You could just use ordinary wheels and tires, and the existing road, what remains of the rail bed would carry a road very cheaply, as long as you weren't running heavy trucks on it. I'm really concerned that the systems for reporting on the condition of the vehicle are effective and quick, and result in the vehicle being taken off the road and maintained speedily. It's not clear to me how the bill is working in that area. I listened carefully to what the noble Lord Lytton said about road design and AVs being able to signal to others that they are AVs, and which roads are safe. No. We ought to be able to license AVs just to go on the roads that are safe for AVs to use, and not the ones where we know they're going to run into difficulties. All those sort of aspects, I don't doubt that the Noble Lord will be putting down amendments on them, and I shall be there to take a close interest in them. Also, the aspects of safety mentioned by the Noble Baroness Lady Bowles of Barkhamsted and Lord Berkeley, I thought absolutely on point. How, if you're going to define safety, and it's got such a crucial place in this bill, it has to be an effective and practical definition. We really have to understand how it works. The words that are there at the moment are just too indefinite and imprecise. Does it effectively rule these out for 10 years, or does it allow anything? It's just not clear at the moment. And insurance is obviously going to be an important area. People like cyclists who don't carry their own insurance, cyclists and pedestrians, need an easy, quick way of getting compensated when they're hurt by an AV. We need to keep the sort of model we have for being injured by a vehicle at the moment, and make sure that they apply to an AV in all circumstances. And noble lords will not be surprised that I shall be pursuing the general question of automated vehicles and Eastbourne. I think people have talked about AVs in the middle of London. I don't think that's the best place to start with them. Somewhere like Eastbourne, where public transport doesn't work, you can use AVs to make public transport happen. We should be able to move away from being the town with the highest proportion of short vehicle journeys to one that is much more reliant on public transport, because automated vehicles should make that economic. And also we can start to look after tourists much better in terms of getting them out to the neighbouring attractions and around the countryside, and enabling bicycling and disabled access and other things which are really difficult to do with current systems. So it's the opportunities that I see, not the disadvantages of cluttering up Piccadilly, that I really hope to pursue in the committee stage of this bill.
My noble lords, it's with great pleasure I take part in my first second reading debate, and pleasure to follow the noble Lord Lucas. And I wasn't going to mention it, but he has raised the point of standards, and I think that's a critical point. Although never let a standard stand in the way of innovation, I take that from a lesson in industry where a long time ago, when we were working on the platform to deliver the Oyster card, there was a European standard that was going to be coming through around how contactless technology could work, and there was a debate about should we wait for that standard. Obviously, most people were saying we should. It would allow interoperability across Europe. I had other thoughts. I thought this could take a significant amount of time and delay the programme. We did push through and used our standard. At the end of the day, if we had waited, we could have been waiting the best part of a decade for that standard to be ratified. So something to consider as we look at standards and the speed of innovation. But as I say, it's with great pleasure to take part in this debate. I want to acknowledge my register of interests, particularly board member of Tech UK and senior executive at Atos. I think also I want to take the point, and I think noble Lord Moylan, my noble friend, who he and I share many interests around transport in our time at City Hall and working with TfL. I will echo a number of the comments he made, but I think the point around this bill and the immense amount of work that I acknowledge that the Law Commission has put in over the last 4 years is demonstrated in the quality of the bill. But it does focus on legislation, and it is quite narrow in some of the things, and that's why we do meander across on other areas about the usage and maybe even more about the commercialisation around the technology. And to balance things out, I did take note of other reports, such as the excellent report by the APPG for self-driving vehicles, the economic and safety benefit of self-driving vehicles, Tech UK's consultation with industry and what they see as opportunities, and also Innovate UK's report on connected and automated mobility. All of these look at the innovation and the opportunity, particularly alongside the need for safety. But I'd like to take my noble lords back a little bit to an early point in my career in 2008, when I first drove an electric vehicle in San Francisco. San Francisco in California has been mentioned a few times in this debate. And the reason I was there and the reason I was driving it, because there was new technology. Obviously, there was an issue about sustainability. It was exciting. But what we saw then was the potential of where this technology could go. It was undefined. They were still using, I think, laptop batteries sort of stuck together in the boot of these cars, and they were the early Tesla Roadsters. But there was such potential, and I think that was a point that we realised also in London and at City Hall, that we'd established the London Electric Vehicle Partnership to look at the potential of this new technology, not just through the prism of legislation, but we would identify challenges in collaboration with industry, in collaboration with policymakers, in collaboration with manufacturers, so that we could understand the challenges, the operational designs that would be required, the infrastructure requirements, and potential commercial models that would be appropriate. Now, it would still take some time for all of this to come to the fore, but I would like to say that some of what we see in not just the adoption of electric vehicles in London, but in the UK, was based way back then in our collaborative approach with industry around how we look to develop policy. And I would like to point out to the Minister, maybe in his deliberations as we go forward in the passage of this bill and in committee stage, that we work extensively with industry around their developments and thoughts, and as well as, I think has been mentioned, internationally in how use cases are being developed for automated vehicles. I think also I would like to highlight various comments from the Noble Baroness Bennett about how some of the challenges that might occur. I would probably say this is not an either-or solution as technology moves forward, as we move towards a digital society. I personally can maybe be a slight use case here. We have one car now, whereas me with 2 children and a wife may have had 2 in the years gone by. I can honestly say my second car is an Uber, because I've moved to that flexible mode of technology, and it provides an element of, in the multimodal mix that I use. Travelling in various parts, I will potentially walk to a metro station. I'll potentially then take an Uber at another end and take a bus when possible. What we're looking at is the maturity of the mix and where these automated vehicles could play in that mix, and hopefully not add to the vehicle fleet, but actually become part of it and reduce the need for people to have their own vehicles and own their own vehicles. My Lords, I speak and I feel great confidence in the technology. The reason I say that is because, to be fair, the technology is already here. It is being used and tested. What we have is, quite right, a focus on what will be the safety element and how will we ensure that we can convince the public that this is safe to use. I think that is the priority here, because safety leads to confidence, confidence leads to adoption, and that will be the success. And then that will lead to other areas of innovation, because actually the tip of the iceberg is what this technology will do to actually the transport mix. What it will do to general industries across the board, what, as my noble friend Lord Moylan mentioned, the pods, what will they become? And here I would like to make the analogy with the smartphone. We can think of these automated vehicles as the equivalent to where a smartphone has now taken what used to be a phone. There will be apps, there will be different commercial ways of using them. There will be all kinds of services that will be developed that we possibly can't even imagine right now, but they will also benefit mobility, personal mobility, as well as public mobility, and yes, safety, and yes, inclusivity will be increased, and sustainability. I think these are all within our grasp through development of this technology. And let's not forget also, if we look at mobile phone technology, the acceleration that we saw in the ability to ensure connectivity, avoid bugs in the system, that we can all see right now. But actually, when we look at that technology, on which life depends almost, we don't find those difficulties as much as we thought. My Lords, to conclude, I would like to say that I am hugely supportive of this bill, if you couldn't tell already. I look forward to taking part in the committee stage. I think there are many lessons for us to learn, and I request of the Noble Minister that we look at how EV operating models have developed, because I do think, and I think Lord Lucas was highlighting this, there will be much synergy between how electric vehicles have developed and the usage of electric vehicle technology going forward and automated vehicles. It has remained unsaid whether they will be actually together as a technology. They may still be separated, but I think the win here for us will be when these technologies merge, but therefore their operating models will have some alignment. And just finally, I would add that I think the use cases around non-user involvement around the technology, I think here we do need to look at having this more separated from the user-included technology approach, because there will be more use cases around the non-user approach than the user approach. And so when I was reading the bill, I thought that part of it is something that we could probably look to separate further and dig into more, which I do look forward to doing in the committee stage.
My Lords, this has been a really excellent debate, and I want to start by making clear that I welcome this bill, especially as Lord Naseby Noble Lord Naseby has pointed out, other countries have been getting ahead of us on this issue. The Noble Lord Moylan expressed concern that Northern Ireland was going to obey the same rules as the Republic of Ireland because they were EU rules. But actually, the international context is heaps bigger than that. This is all in a massive international context. So this bill is welcome and is based, of course, on the work of the law commissions, which have provided firm legal foundations. And as others have said, there is huge economic significance in the successful rollout of automated vehicles. In order for that to happen, in order for it to be successful, we need high levels of public trust and confidence in safety. Hopefully, once we have in due course persuaded the Noble Lord the Minister to accept some of our amendments, we will have a robust legal and safety framework which clarifies responsibility for self-driving vehicles, which establishes new safety requirements and an inspection and reporting system, and which provides confidence in data ownership and security. And those issues have been raised time and again in this debate. If this works properly, then AVs should increase greatly the safety on our roads. But there are, my lords, plenty of issues along the way in the transitional phases, many of which have been raised here this afternoon. And the experience in San Francisco in California is very relevant in this respect, because it points out that even in a city with much wider, straighter roads, and with roads which are basically in a heaps better state than British roads, there can be considerable obstacles and unforeseen obstacles. In Britain, we have very crowded, mainly very poorly maintained roads, and that is going to intensify the issues. There will be, for many decades, a time when AVs will share the roads with traditional human drivers. And there have been problems in San Francisco with that, because basically emergency services have been impeded because AVs don't yet have human sensitivity. We all know that if you hear a siren or see a blue light somewhere a long way away, we can anticipate that that's That's going to be something we have to deal with. We've got to get it out of the way. But it clearly seems that AVs in San Francisco haven't quite got to that point yet. Now, much of this bill is taken up with issues of legal responsibility. For example, at what I call the handover point between the automated driving and the human driver. And the bill is complex and technical, and it introduces a whole new lexicon which is hardly consumer-friendly and is therefore, it might be designed to provide legal certainty, but it doesn't enhance driver understanding. And I think the government needs to consider what needs to be done to ensure that drivers in due course do understand the points, the legal points involved, especially in relation to insurance. There are implications in all of this for us in the long transition period, leading up to that point in the future when all vehicles will be automated. And there are two aspects I particularly want to point out. That there will be some AVs driving amongst human drivers from the near future onwards. And there will also be vehicles that are partially automated, as indeed many are already. And the Noble Lord Lytton recounted some stories that had a resonance with me as the owner of a car that I regard as more complex than the one before, because it tries to do things for me that actually I can do okay, I think, on my own. And I sometimes think you nowadays need the driver and you need the co-driver to handle the technology. But the serious point about that is that halfway house in many cars now exists, and we are dealing with it on a regular day-to-day basis. Now, for the revolution to happen, first of all, we need a giant database of all the road signs and regulations in every part of the UK. Now, this in itself is a massive task, because actually the government has been moving away from absolute direction of local authorities on road signs. I'll give you one example. In 2016, the specifications for the signs for a Ford were removed, so any old sign basically will do for telling a driver that there's a Ford coming up. I happen to know about this because I tried to I put a proposal to reinstate the regulations on Fords into the private members' bill ballot and didn't get anywhere with it. So, but the point is, for safety reasons, there are good arguments for having proper regulated sizes for the signs. But the government has also recently removed some of the pressure on local authorities to introduce regulations to make it safer for walking and cycling. This "we are the driver's friend" rhetoric means that there will be fewer regulations that encourage walking and cycling. So the government's going to have to turn its rhetoric on its head in order to encourage local authorities to take part in this giant data gathering. And this, of course, will involve cost to local authorities. And I notice that there is no financial impact on local authorities included in this. Now, I referred to a giant database, but it isn't just local authorities. Of course, all AVs, and indeed the cars that already exist with some self-driving features, like those that park themselves and so on, they're all collecting data on us every time we drive them. This in itself has privacy implications, personal safety implications, national security implications. It poses questions on anonymisation of data, on the rights of individuals in respect of personal data, on issues of retention of data, and issues on the disclosure of personal data to insurers, and I'm sure some other things as well that I haven't thought of. Now, my noble friend Baroness Bowles concentrated on the implications of data control in the industry and the danger of dominance by big companies. She alerted us to the complex issues in the insurance industry and the issues associated with access to commercially useful data. And my noble friend Baroness Brinton also raised concerns about the protection of personal data and the issue of sale of data. And both the noble Lord Holmes and Baroness Brinton raised potential problems for disabled people and the need to build disability access into regulations from the start. And these are issues not apparently tackled in the bill, relating along with, for example, issues associated with human behaviour. For example, the difference between the fastest amongst us to respond to a call to hand over from automatic driving to human driving, the difference between the fastest and the slowest. Those slowest who might have been paying full attention but just respond slightly more slowly. There is the issue I think that we need to think about if you regularly drive a car that fully use a car that fully drives itself, and then you get out of the habit of driving, will there be a requirement for drivers to have refresher courses on driving because they haven't done it for the last month or the last year because their car has done it for them? This is something which I think will crop up. We will in due course want to press the Minister on the rather confusing division of responsibilities between various government agencies as listed in the government's proposals. And finally, I want to deal with the Minister's introduction, which referred to trial schemes, but there is a giant leap from those very limited trial schemes through to the transition period. Make no mistake, my lords, we're in the foothills of a massive revolution. We are in the foothills of a change where we lose many types of jobs that involve driving as part of that job. There will be a complete revolution, I believe, in public transport, in ownership of vehicles. And for public confidence to be maintained during this revolution, we need the government to invest in the new skills that will be needed, and there will be lots of new skills needed, and the training for those skills. My lords, we've had a division between the enthusiasts versus the realists versus the doubters, and I look forward to our debate on amendments.
Well, my lords, can I first of all make clear that the opposition, the Labour Party, supports the principle of this measure. though as we've seen in this debate, there's a wide-ranging set of issues that arise, which I dare say the civil servants who've been listening to it will be busily examining over the coming days. And I think we are looking forward here to a somewhat extended committee stage if some of these issues are judged within the scope of the bill. But it also will be a very entertaining one if we continue to have contributions like we had from Lord Naseby and and some of the other lords who've spoken. Now, why do we support this bill? Because we've basically got to move forward desperately in this country to try and raise our rate of economic growth. And one of the most obvious ways of doing this is to harness through successful commercial exploitation the advances in science and technology for which we as a country are renowned. So this is crucial to our future, part of a big agenda that's crucial to our future prosperity. And we do have a real problem. I mean, if I'm putting this in a non-party political way, in the John Major and Tony Blair premierships, national productivity rose from 91 to 2007 by 27%. Since 2007, it has risen by 1.7%. So we have a dramatic growth problem, and this is a subset, I suppose, of the artificial intelligence revolution, which we have to be part of if we're going to succeed as a country. And my friend and colleague in the other place, Peter Kyle, who's now looking in charge of innovation and research, whatever that new department's called, he sees this question of how we mobilize these technological advances for growth as one of the great progressive causes of our time. I also think the government has, in some respects, gone about it in the right way in trying to establish a partnership body with injecting public money in partnership with the academic expertise, the scientists, the engineers, and the corporations. I share Baroness Bowles' view that this should not exclude the smaller innovators. But I also very much share my colleague's view, Lord Tunnicliffe's, that any partnership work should involve the trade unions, because, as someone was saying, this is going to have enormous consequences for jobs in future, and we must involve the trade unions from an early stage. Now, the bill is a legal and technical bill, and it's necessary, but of course it's not the whole answer. It's not a policy framework for autonomous vehicles. It also has to deal... one thing I felt reading it was that if only we had a magic wand, and we could bring automated vehicles into play overnight and just get rid of all we have now, then this bill would be a perfect example of how to regulate for it. But we're not in that situation. What in fact we're facing is a situation of decades of hybridity or a mixed system, whatever however you want to describe it, and that's the immediate regulatory task that we face. And if I could just pick the Minister up on one point he made early on in his remarks, he said, the safety benefits of automated vehicles are, I think you said, plain to see. Well, they might be in this idealized future, which we might get there sometime, but are they plain to see in this hybrid world, which is going to be the real world of the next 20 or 30 years? And I think there are lots of issues about what are the safety standards we set. You know, if we have accidents, and a significant number of accidents, this will put back the development of these technologies in a very rapid way. I picked up an article in the Financial Times, so that is a great authority, by a Mr. Richard Waters describing what had happened in California, where the regulators have actually halted operations at Cruise, which is the General Motors driverless car division, because of accidents that have occurred in California. Well, we don't want to get ourselves into that situation. So we have to move forward in a way that we will prevent this kind of eventuality. And there are lots and lots of issues about it. And I think the insurance and legal questions to do with what happens when a so-called transition demand occurs are very complicated. I think the issue which the House of Commons Transport Select Committee raised in a very good report of if we have drivers who become gradually reliant on automated systems, what happens to their driving skills? And how do we keep their driving skills up to date? And what sort of test do you have to pass in order to be a driver who part relies on automation, but then is capable of taking hold in an emergency, perhaps, I know some people say, 10 seconds. Well, you know, if you're doing your emails or talking on the phone to an important colleague, would you actually be capable of doing this in 10 seconds? I don't know. There seems to me to be a lot of issues to do with it. And of course there are other issues, not just to do with the car and the systems and the driver, but also to do with the networks within which these vehicles are going to run. The failings in digital connectivity is the one obvious one. But I can tell you, as someone who's just finished 10 years on Cumbria County Council, that if someone told us that we had to spend, you know, millions of pounds on a database of our road system, I would be getting lots of Conservative councillors getting up to me and saying, "You're not wasting your money on all of that. What about the potholes?" And I think that we would have a real problem with local authority finance in what strikes me to be a potentially very costly exercise. And then there's the question of regulation of the agencies in the Department of Transport that are going to have to put these systems in place. There's a question of the skills. Will the people in the agencies have the right skills to do the job properly? Because we all know that what will happen is that the brightest people and the most capable people will be employed by the companies which will have the sources of expertise. So I think there are lots of issues that we need to face. We do need an effective system of regulation. And we've got to think about how that's going to work. We don't want a system of regulation that is sort of holds things back, that, you know, where the man with the red flag has to walk in front of the vehicle. We've got to avoid that kind of regulation, but equally we've got to approach it from the point that people are going to expect that this new technology will produce not just the status quo in safety, but a real advance in safety, with fewer accidents, fewer deaths, fewer life-changing injuries. The key, in my view, is to develop a regulatory system that is capable of rapid adaptability. Now, that's an easy thing to say, but when you think about regulation and the way it works, or I've observed it working in Britain in many different forms, it isn't very adaptable. We have great crises that result in regulatory reviews. They come up with long reports that, you know, make lots of recommendations, and then those reports sort of lay on people's shelves and don't get acted upon. We have to be more flexible and adaptable than we have been. So regulation is a good thing, but it's got to be a flexible and adaptable regulation. We've got to get away from the mindset that, you know, as little regulation as possible is what is good for the country. We've got to have good regulation, not bad regulation. And if we have that, then it is possible we may be able to take advantage of the great opportunities that these technological advances offer.
Yeah.
My Lords, I'm very grateful to Noble Lords for their very thoughtful contributions and fascinating contributions indeed on the bill before your Lordship's House today. I will attempt to respond to as many questions and concerns as possible, and where I haven't been able to, I will certainly follow up in writing. My Lords, let me begin once again with safety. The Noble Lord, Lord Berkeley, my noble friend Lord Holmes of Richmond, Lord Hampton, my noble friend Lord Lucas and others have rightly highlighted the debate about the exact safety standard to which self-driving vehicles should be held. As the Noble Lord, Lord Borwick, rightly pointed out, the long-term safety benefits of these vehicles could be truly vast. However, these will not be realised if the public lose confidence early on, or if an unnecessarily high threshold is imposed from the outset. A careful balance must therefore be struck. We believe that the careful and competent driver standard in our safety ambition strikes that balance most appropriately. As I have said, the standard is considerably higher than that of the average driver on UK roads. It is the highest of the three standards on which the Law Commission consulted, and the same one to which human drivers are held. By setting out the statement of safety principles in statutory guidance informed by this safety ambition, we will be able to raise standards over time as the technology improves or as the public expectations change. And this approach is in line with the Law Commission's recommendations. My noble friend Lord Holmes of Richmond also asked how and when we would review the safety of self-driving vehicles. The bill sets out a flexible, future-proof framework that can be adapted and updated in line with technological developments. While we don't believe it would be appropriate to specify time periods for review on the face of the bill, we of course recognise the importance of transparency and regular reporting. Clause 38 therefore creates a general monitoring duty requiring the Secretary of State to publish an annual report on the performance of self-driving vehicles and how this aligns with safety standards. This leads me to the points made by Noble Lord, Lord Liddell, the Noble Lord, the Earl Lytton, and the Noble Lady Baroness Randerson on whether this framework will work in a world with a mix of self-driving and manual vehicles. The Law Commission's recommendations accepted by the Government set out a framework that is designed to work for a mix of traffic where self-driving vehicles will share the road with conventional human drivers and vulnerable road users. Similarly, in response to the Noble Lord Naisby's question in this area, self-driving vehicles will need to be able to safely operate using existing infrastructure, and therefore we do not anticipate any immediate changes in current provision or practices. To satisfy the self-driving test, vehicles must drive safely and legally, in accordance with road rules and conditions which apply to everyone. Again, in response to my noble friend Lord Holmes of Richmond asking if government would ban human-driven vehicles if self-driving vehicles were found to be much safer. We reiterate nothing in the bill seeks to restrict any existing road users exercising their right to use roads or other public places. The Noble Lord Cameron of Dillington raised the possibility of jaywalking laws restricting pedestrians from crossing roads except at pedestrian crossings. In response to this, I'd point out that to the analysis by the Law Commission, which said that to restrict the freedom of movement of pedestrians due to the insufficiencies in automated vehicle functionalities does not appear justified at this time. The Noble Baroness Lady Randerson and the Noble Baroness Lady Bowles raised the issue of cybersecurity. Vehicles with automated systems will be subject to detailed technical cybersecurity assessment as part of the well-established type approval process. Indeed, the DFT co-chairs the UN group that developed the new international regulations for vehicle cybersecurity. Separately, the DFT runs its own cyber safety and assurance program for self-driving vehicles, working closely with the National Cyber Security Centre, other government departments and our international partners. This has included developing a bespoke cyber training program for technical staff supported by the NCSC, National Cyber Security Centre. Turning to the pertinent issue of accessibility, as raised by my noble friend Lord Holmes of Richmond, the Noble Baroness Lady Brinton and the Noble Baroness Lady Bennett. The granting of self-driving authorisations will be subject to the public sector equality duty, and government intends to make equality impact assessments part of the authorisation process. The Noble Baroness Lady Brinton raised concerns that by displaying existing taxi, private hire and bus legislation, by disapplying existing taxi, private hire and bus legislation, important accessibility protections may not apply. Clause 87 of the bill requires that automated passenger permits could only be granted with a view to improving the understanding of how these services can be provided and designed for older and disabled passengers. Service providers will also need to report back on the lessons learned. Turning now to some of the specifics on how we expect these vehicles to operate, the Noble Baroness Lady Bowles, the Noble Baroness Lady Randerson, the Noble Lord Liddell and others asked about the transition demand, in particular how we will ensure users are given sufficient time to safely resume control. The bill requires that transition periods be long enough for the user in charge to resume control, including any time required to regain situational awareness and prepare themselves. Transition demands will use a combination of visual, acoustic and haptic warnings. The exact time required will vary significantly by use case and is therefore not set out on the face of the bill. Authorisation will assess whether a self-driving feature's transition demand is of sufficient duration and whether it issues appropriate cues given the contexts. This may also be assessed as part of vehicle type approval. The Noble Baroness Lady Bowles and others also asked about the interaction between self-driving vehicles and the insurance industry and about how we will ensure insurers have access to appropriate data. Following a road incident, a claimant would notify the insurer. The insurer would need access to data recorded by the vehicle to determine in the first instance how the claim will be handled. The Secretary of State will have the power to create provision in secondary legislation for the vehicle to record and retain data to determine liabilities and to ensure the insurer has access to that data. The Noble Lord Tunnicliffe asked how the framework would deal with a breakdown or other incident occurring to a no user in charge vehicle, given there may be no human present in the vehicle at the time. So every no user in charge vehicle will be overseen by a licensed no user in charge operator. These operators will be responsible for responding to incidents such as breakdowns. We will be able to set detailed conditions as part of the operator licensing, ensuring they have the right capabilities in place to respond to such incidents. The Noble Lord Berkeley asked about issues with self-driving vehicles crossing international borders. Given domestic regulations on these technologies are still in their infancy, there are as yet no international agreements governing vehicles passing from one jurisdiction to another. We have been engaging with our international partners to develop guidelines on the use of these vehicles and to encourage consistency in domestic approaches. In the interim, we anticipate vehicles will be designed to deactivate any self-driving features when outside their intended domain of operation. We would also have the power to require this through authorization conditions if necessary. The communication about authorization for use of self-driving will be made clear that it applies only to Great Britain. We will monitor rules in other countries to determine what messages should be provided for users of authorized vehicles which intend to use them outside Great Britain. Similarly, my noble friend Lord Moylan and the noble lady Baroness Randerson raised the issue of vehicles passing into Northern Ireland. The core provisions of the bill do not extend to Northern Ireland in line with Road Traffic Act 1988, which extends to Great Britain only. Northern Ireland has its own traffic laws. Accordingly, the authorisation for use as self-driving does not extend to Northern Ireland, and in the absence of specific rules on their use there, the vehicle would be treated as conventional and the driver would be liable for its behaviour. Throughout the review led by the Law Commission and the development of the bill, we have kept the Northern Ireland Executive briefed on our plans. The Noble Lord Tunnicliffe and the Noble Lord Liddell asked about jobs and growth. We believe the self-driving sector could create more than 38,000 new, well-paid jobs up and down the country by 2035. The UK, being a leader in self-driving technology, will attract inward investment and commercial opportunities, as mentioned by the Noble Lord Ranger. These new jobs could range from the design and manufacture of vehicles to overseeing safe and secure passenger operations. Turning briefly to address questions of scope, the Noble Lord Tunnicliffe mentioned the question of so-called pavement bots. The bill is designed to cover all road vehicles. While the legal definition of roads does include the pavement, the use of vehicles on pavements is limited through the 1835 Highway Act. Any future changes to regulations regarding pavement use would need to be balanced with the need to maintain safety and accessibility for other road users. We are funding research to better understand the opportunities and risks associated with this particular technology. The Noble Lord Bourne of Aberystwyth asked a question on government's plans for industries out of scope of this bill, such as aircraft. I can assure the Noble Lord that the UK's strategic vision is to maximise benefits of automated air and maritime technologies, as well as road technologies. We will publish a Future of Flight Action Plan that will set out the strategic direction for the aviation industry, developed through the Future of Flight Industry Group. On data, the Noble Baroness Lady Bowles, the Noble Baroness Lady Brinton and the Noble Lord Borwick correctly pointed out that large quantities of data will be created and used to enable self-driving. Data may need to be shared to ensure safety is maintained and operations such as insurance continue to function efficiently. However, data must remain properly protected. Self-driving vehicles will be subject to existing data protection laws in the UK. Our proposed bill does not alter that, so manufacturers and government will have to ensure data is protected. The bill allows data to be requested for monitoring of self-driving vehicle safety and for investigation of incidents. As the Noble Baroness mentioned, the Secretary of State may make regulations authorising information gathered to be shared with other persons. These regulations will be subject to consultation and considered in the House. It will be an offence for persons to share data or use it for other purposes unless authorised by those regulations. However, the Noble Baroness Lady Bowles pointed out the provisions under Clause 42, Clause 7 are very wide. We will reflect further on the Noble Baroness's comment to ensure that the right balance of safety, commercial interests and personal data protection is maintained. The Noble Lord Tunnicliffe asked about the rationale behind the misleading marketing offences in the bill. The inclusion of these offences was specifically recommended by the Law Commission, as they felt that the current law would leave some gaps in protection. For example, the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations 2008 only apply if a customer makes a transactional decision, like buying a car. This is too narrow and leaves a gap, as the risk of misunderstanding a vehicle's self-driving capability is not confined to the purchase alone. It could include, for example, borrowing the vehicle from a friend. As the Noble Baroness Lady Randerson and other noble lords have pointed out this afternoon, it is vital that we build and maintain public consent for this new technology. In 2022, the Department for Transport funded an award-winning and unprecedented study called the Great Self-Driving Exploration. The study was explicitly designed to allow people from all walks of life to engage with self-driving vehicles, understand how they might affect their lives, address existing transport challenges, and whether or not this would be a good thing. The learning from this research is being used to develop future engagement plans, which are being developed with trialling organisations, industry, academia and road safety groups, including through the government-led AV Drive group. The Noble Baroness Lady Randerson raised the question of how government will administer this new framework. We intend that delivery of these new processes will rest with the Department of Transport's executive agencies, in line with their existing responsibilities for conventional vehicles. We expect the Vehicle Certification Agency to assume responsibility for the initial authorisation process. Authorisation of self-driving vehicles will, in many cases, use vehicle type approval to support assessments of safety. As the UK's designated type approval authority, the VCA is therefore well placed to carry out this new function. On NUIC operator licensing, we expect the Driver and Vehicle Standards Agency to be responsible for the NUIC operator licensing and enforcement. The DVSA is already responsible for licensing passenger service and freight operators and has existing powers for stopping and testing vehicles. The in-use regulatory system applies across both authorisation and operator licensing and, as the Noble Baroness points out, will require close cooperation between the agencies. On the question of capacity and capability raised by the Noble Lord Liddell, these roles for the VCA and DVSA are being developed as part of our ongoing safety assurance programme. We are working with the VCA and external partners to begin to put in place the right skills, facilities and processes to deliver this new regime. And this has included developing existing staff and creating new roles to cover critical areas like cybersecurity, simulation and machine learning, and also establishing new facilities in Bristol and the Midlands focused on assessing complex electronic systems and also conducting research into potential assessment methodologies. Similarly, the DVSA has established a dedicated team to consider the new processes that may be necessary to support NUIC operator licensing and in-use regulation. My noble friend Lord Bourne of Aberystwyth asked a question on the budget for the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles. The Centre is a specialist policy directorate working across the Department for Transport and Department for Business and Trade. At the last spending review, the CCAV received 100 million covering a 3-year period to 2025. 66 million of that funding was for research and development into the commercialisation of the technology. 34 million was to fund the research and evidence required to develop the regulatory framework, including funding for capability building in the motoring agencies. The work that CCAV does is not just limited to funding. My noble friend Lord Bourne also asked what international engagement has taken place. UK officials take part in key international UN, including the Global Forum for Road Traffic Safety and the Forum for the Harmonisation of Vehicle Standards. As noble lords would expect, UK officials also regularly engage bilaterally with counterparts in those other nations that are developing legislation and standards in this space. My Lords, I'm conscious of the time, and I apologise perhaps that I've not been able to address all the questions raised by Noble Lords, and I certainly stand ready to provide further detailed briefings to Noble Lords where required, and obviously we'll check the record to see what has been missed, and we'll address that in writing. But we've heard a healthy mix of views this afternoon, and I think there is general consensus that utmost care and attention will be necessary if we are to build a system that can capture the benefits of self-driving vehicles while winning the confidence of the public, which is absolutely essential. I'm therefore extremely grateful for all Noble Lords' insightful contributions, and I look forward to discussing these further as we move to committee. My Lords, I beg to move.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. As many as that opinion will say content, contrary not content, the contents have it.
My Lords, I beg to move the second motion standing in my name on the order paper.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as that opinion will say content, contrary not content, the contents have it.
My Lords, I beg to move that the House do now adjourn.
That the House do now adjourn.
The proceeding has ended. 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 TV. Parliament Live.tv. 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 ParliamentLive.tv. 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 ParliamentLive.tv.